I hired a cleaning lady while my son and his wife were on vacation in Paris. An hour later, she called me sounding completely panicked. She cried into the phone that she heard someone sobbing behind the walls in the attic, and she knew it was not the television. I rushed over and found out exactly what they were hiding in that dark space. My blood began to boil. My name is Mitchell Crawford. I am 69 years old. What I discovered that afternoon made me realize my own family was capable of unimaginable cruelty. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed is the quickest way to destroy a family. I was in my garage tinkering with an old lawnmower when my cell phone vibrated against the workbench. The caller ID showed Rosa. I had hired Rosa, a hard-working immigrant woman who never complained, to do a deep clean of my son Cameron's house while he and his wife Megan were away. Rosa was usually a woman of very few words, but today her voice was shaking so violently I could barely understand her frantic sentences. She told me she was dusting the second-floor hallway when she heard a strange, continuous noise. She thought it was an appliance left on, but as she pressed her ear against the wall, she realized it was a human voice. A faint, broken weeping coming from the unfinished attic above the garage. She told me the heavy oak door leading upstairs was locked from the outside with a massive iron padlock. I did not ask any questions. I dropped my wrench, got into my 10-year-old sedan, and drove straight to their upscale suburban neighborhood. My heart hammered against my ribs with every mile I covered. I knew Cameron and Megan were hiding things from me. I knew Megan was arrogant, constantly putting on airs, and Cameron was weak, bending to her every whim. But a locked door with someone crying inside was a different level of wrong entirely. I parked in the driveway of their sprawling $1.5 million mansion, a property that I secretly purchased for them through an anonymous trust. Rosa was waiting on the front porch, her face pale and her hands trembling in pure terror. I told her to wait in the kitchen and stay completely quiet. I walked up the grand hardwood stairs with a heavy steel crowbar tightly gripped in my hand. The hallway of their home was perfectly decorated, looking like a page out of a luxury design magazine. Megan loved expensive art, imported rugs, and crystal chandeliers. She always portrayed the flawless image of a sophisticated modern white woman who knew better than everyone else, especially her working-class African-American father-in-law. She frequently spoke to me with a condescending tone, offering unsolicited advice on how I should manage my meager pension and live out my retirement. I always nodded and smiled, playing the perfect role of the tired, simple old man she believed me to be. I reached the end of the long hallway. There it was. A solid wood door leading to the attic stairs secured with a thick iron padlock that looked entirely out of place in such an elegant house. I pressed my ear against the polished wood. A soft, continuous whimpering drifted through the tiny gaps. I raised the crowbar and smashed it against the lock with all my strength. Once. Twice. The metal gave way with a loud, violent crack. I kicked the door open and stepped onto the dark staircase. The intense heat hit me instantly as I climbed. The attic was completely unfinished, suffocatingly hot, and smelled strongly of stale urine and decay. It was a stark, horrifying contrast to the pristine, air-conditioned luxury just a few feet below us. The only light in the cavernous space came from a small, dusty window near the pitched roof. In the far corner, lying on a stained, bare mattress, was a fragile, trembling figure. I took a step closer, my eyes slowly adjusting to the oppressive gloom. It was an elderly white woman curled into a tight fetal position, clutching a crushed box of cheap cookies against her chest. Her hair was heavily matted, her clothes were filthy and torn, and her arms were dangerously thin. I recognized her immediately despite her deteriorated state. It was Evelyn, Megan's own mother. My mind raced to process the horror in front of me. This made absolutely no logical sense. For the past 2 years, I had been sending exactly $10,000 every single month to a dedicated account Megan managed. That money was specifically designated to pay for Evelyn care at Silver Pines, an exclusive top-tier luxury nursing home. Megan had proudly shown me glossy brochures of the facility. She had told me elaborate stories of how happy her mother was, participating in daily water aerobics, painting classes, and social events. Every single month, Cameron would thank me for my boundless generosity, telling me how grateful they were that my hard-earned savings could provide Evelyn with such a dignified retirement. I had built a massive logistics and trucking empire in the 1980s. I fought through systemic prejudice, cutthroat competitors, and brutal economic downturns to secure federal transport contracts. I made tens of millions of dollars through blood, sweat, and relentless determination, but I chose to live my later years simply. I hid my vast wealth in trusts because I wanted my son to build his own character and earn his own way. Yet I quietly funded the things that truly mattered, like Evelyn medical care, because I firmly believed family took care of family. I looked around the miserable, sweltering attic. There was a plastic bucket in the corner that clearly served as a toilet. There was a single plastic jug of warm water. The temperature in the room had to be well over 90 degrees. I had been transferring $10,000 a month for a luxury medical facility, and my daughter-in-law had locked her own mother in a wooden oven to steal the money. Cameron knew about this. He lived in this very house. My son, my own flesh and blood, was complicit in torturing a helpless elderly woman to fund his luxurious lifestyle and designer suits. The sheer audacity of their greed was staggering. I walked over to the mattress and knelt down gently. Evelyn flinched violently when I approached her. She tried to press her frail body further into the rough wooden wall, raising her trembling hands to protect her face. Her eyes were wide with a primal animalistic fear. She did not recognize me at all. The Evelyn I knew was a vibrant, chatty woman who loved gardening and baking pies for the holidays. The woman cowering in front of me was a broken shell, completely stripped of her human dignity. I spoke to her in the softest, calmest voice I could muster, telling her she was safe, telling her it was Mitchell. She lowered her hands slightly, her cloudy, sunken eyes staring right through me. She reached out and grabbed my sleeve with fingers that felt like dry, fragile twigs. Her voice was just a raspy, painful whisper. She begged me not to tell Megan that she had eaten the cookies. She cried and said she was sorry for making a mess. She looked around the dark room in sheer panic, her chest heaving, and whispered that if Megan found out she was making noise, she would tie her up again. Those words stopped the air in my lungs. She would tie her up again. The reality of what my son and his wife were doing settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket of ice. They were not just opportunistic thieves. They were absolute monsters. I looked at the dark purple bruises circling Evelyn's thin wrists. I looked at the filthy mattress she was forced to sleep on. I felt a powerful sensation I had not felt in over 20 years. When I was building my transport company from nothing, I had to be absolutely ruthless. I had to destroy men who smiled in my face while trying to bankrupt me behind my back. I left that aggressive version of Mitchell Crawford in the past when my beloved wife passed away. I chose to be a quiet, peaceful retiree who tended to his garden and drove an old car. But looking at Evelyn sobbing in the dirt, that old Mitchell woke up immediately. The cold, calculating businessman who crushed his enemies without a second thought came rushing back to the surface. I did not shout. I did not break things or lose my temper. True power does not throw tantrums. True power observes, calculates, and strikes when the enemy is completely exposed and vulnerable. Cameron and Megan thought they had successfully deceived a naive, simple old man. They thought they could easily steal my money and torture a helpless woman without facing any consequences. They had absolutely no idea who they were truly dealing with. The war had just begun. I turned to Rosa and placed a steady hand on her trembling shoulder. I did not scream. I did not throw a fit of rage or shatter the expensive vases lining the pristine hallway. The aggressive, ruthless businessman from my past knew that losing your temper only blinded you to the necessary steps ahead. I instructed Rosa in a low, calm voice to go into the master bedroom and bring me the thickest, softest blanket she could find. She scurried away and returned seconds later with a heavy cashmere throw that probably cost more than what she earned in a month. I wrapped Evelyn in the expensive fabric. She offered no resistance. She weighed almost nothing, feeling as fragile as a bundle of dry, hollow reeds in my arms. The stench of the attic clung to her skin, a sickening mixture of neglect and despair. I carried her out of that wooden oven, stepping carefully down the grand staircase. The contrast was absolutely nauseating. I was carrying a starving, abused woman through a house filled with imported Italian marble floors, crystal lighting, and fresh-cut orchids. My son and his wife lived in absolute luxury, while the woman who gave birth to Megan rotted away in the dark just a few feet above their heads. We reached my 10-year-old sedan parked in the driveway. I laid Evelyn gently in the back seat and asked Rosa to sit beside her to keep her calm. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. I did not take her to the local public emergency room. A public hospital would involve standard police reports, endless bureaucracy, and a lack of privacy that would immediately tip off Cameron and Megan. I needed complete, absolute control over the narrative. I drove straight to the most prestigious private medical center in the city, a place where billionaires and politicians went when they needed absolute discretion. The entire ride was completely silent, save for the soft, agonizing whimpers coming from the back seat. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned pale, channeling every ounce of my disgust into a cold, calculated focus. When we arrived at the private hospital, I bypassed the standard emergency waiting room and walked directly to the VIP concierge desk. I pulled out a heavy metal corporate credit card I had not used in years and demanded their best trauma physician immediately. Money talks, and within minutes a team of discreet nurses wheeled Evelyn away on a gurney through a private set of double doors. I instructed Rosa to go home, giving her a generous stack of cash and telling her to speak to absolutely no one about what she saw today. She nodded gratefully and left. I sat alone in the quiet, luxuriously appointed private waiting room staring at the spotless walls. An hour later, a tall, stern-looking physician named Dr. Gallagher walked into the room. His expression was grim, the kind of look a medical professional gets when they have seen the darkest side of human nature. He sat across from me and took a deep, heavy breath. The initial assessment was horrific. He confirmed Evelyn was suffering from severe malnutrition, profound dehydration, and significant muscle atrophy due to prolonged confinement. She had deep purple bruising around her wrists and ankles, indicating she had been repeatedly bound with tight restraints. But the physical starvation was not even the worst part. Dr. Gallagher leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He told me the toxicology screening revealed massive dangerous levels of an industrial veterinary sedative in her bloodstream. It was a heavy tranquilizer typically used to sedate large livestock. Megan was not just neglecting her mother. She was chemically restraining her with animal medication to keep her silent and compliant. The sheer toxicity of the dosage could have caused heart failure at any moment. My jaw tightened into a rigid line. I looked Dr. Gallagher directly in the eyes and told him I was authorizing an absolute information lockdown. I paid a retainer of $50,000 on the spot to ensure Evelyn was registered under a confidential alias. No visitors, no phone calls, no records shared with any outside insurance databases. I made it explicitly clear that if anyone called inquiring about an elderly woman matching her description, the hospital was to deny any knowledge of her existence. Dr. Gallagher agreed immediately, recognizing that we were dealing with a severe criminal matter. I needed Evelyn safe and completely hidden while I prepared the trap for my son and his wife. I was standing by the large window in the private waiting area processing the sickening reality of the animal sedatives when the hospital billing administrator approached me. Her name tag read, Miss Lawson, and she carried a thick folder looking visibly uncomfortable. She asked me to step into her private office to discuss the initial intake paperwork. I sat down, expecting a routine conversation about my deposit, but her hands were shaking slightly as she pulled out a printed report. She explained that standard hospital protocol required them to run the patient's social security number to verify any active medical directives or federal insurance flags. When she ran Evelyn through the system, red warnings immediately flooded her screen. Evelyn Medicare and all her supplemental health benefits had been completely suspended 6 months ago. I asked her how that was possible considering I had been sending $10,000 a month for premium care. Miss Lawson swallowed hard and pushed the paper across the desk toward me. The system flagged Evelyn's identity because her social security number was attached to a massive defaulting debt. Someone had used her identity and her clean credit history to secure a massive commercial loan for a private cosmetic surgery clinic. The loan was severely delinquent, causing federal agencies to freeze all her benefits due to suspected major financial fraud. My eyes scanned the black and white text on the official document, searching for the guarantor of the loan. The primary applicant who had signed the paperwork and secured the fraudulent debt using a helpless old woman identity was not Megan. It was Cameron Crawford, my own son. He was not just a passive bystander turning a blind eye to his wife's cruelty. He was the active architect of the financial fraud. He had stolen his mother-in-law identity, drained her credit to fund a fake cosmetic clinic scheme, and then allowed his wife to drug her and lock her in a sweltering attic to hide the evidence. The betrayal was so deep, so vile, that it eradicated any lingering shred of paternal sympathy I had left in my heart. Cameron was a monster, and I was going to tear his life apart piece by piece. I spent the next 48 hours securing a completely untraceable sanctuary. Once Dr. Gallagher stabilized Evelyn and cleared her for outpatient recovery, I moved her out of the hospital through a secure service elevator. I did not take her to my house or anywhere connected to my public identity. Instead, I drove her to a high-rise luxury condominium downtown. I owned this specific property through a blind trust holding company, which meant Cameron and Megan had absolutely no idea it existed. The apartment was incredibly spacious, filled with warm natural light, and overlooked the city skyline. It was the exact opposite of the suffocating wooden cage they had trapped her inside. I hired a highly vetted private nursing agency to provide around-the-clock medical supervision. A registered nurse named Sarah was stationed there 24/7 to monitor her vitals, administer proper nutrition, and ensure she was never left alone. I spared absolutely no expense outfitting the apartment with an adjustable hospital bed, medical-grade air purifiers, and top-tier security cameras at the entrance. Evelyn was finally safe and entirely off the grid. She spent most of her first day sleeping deeply wrapped in clean Egyptian cotton sheets, far away from the horrors of that attic. Watching her chest rise and fall in a steady, peaceful rhythm reinforced my resolve. I had secured the victim. Now it was time to focus my undivided attention on the predators. I went back to my modest suburban home, the one I officially lived in, and poured myself a cup of black coffee. I sat in my worn-out armchair, waiting patiently for the inevitable check-in from my son. My cell phone buzzed on the coffee table just past noon. The caller ID displayed an international incoming video call from Cameron. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the ruthless business mogul recede into the shadows and pulling the mask of the naive, tired old man firmly over my face. I accepted the call and forced a warm, grandfatherly smile. The screen flickered, and suddenly my living room was filled with the vibrant, glowing backdrop of the Parisian night sky. The iconic, sparkling lights of the Eiffel Tower framed my son and his wife perfectly. Cameron was wearing a tailored navy blazer that I knew cost at least $2,000, while Megan sported a pristine white silk dress and a diamond necklace that caught the ambient light. They were holding crystal flutes of expensive champagne, leaning their heads together to project the ultimate image of a flawless, successful young couple. Megan waved at the camera with a bright, dazzling smile that made my stomach churn. She chimed in with her high-pitched, sugary voice, asking how my quiet little weekend was going. I told them I was just doing some yard work and reading. I played my part perfectly, letting my voice sound a bit raspy and slow. Cameron laughed, taking a sip of his champagne, and told me I needed to get out more. He boasted about their private boat tour on the Seine River and the Michelin-starred restaurant they were heading to next. I nodded enthusiastically, praising his success and telling him how proud I was of the life he was building. Then Megan leaned closer to the screen, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the stem of her glass. Her eyes widened in a display of manufactured innocence and concern. She softly reminded me that the first of the month was coming up. She asked me in the sweetest, most condescending tone possible not to forget to transfer the $10,000 for the Silver Pines facility fee. She actually pouted her lower lip and said she had just spoken to the nursing home administrator that morning. She looked me dead in the eyes through the camera lens and told me her mother was doing wonderfully. She claimed Evelyn had just won a game of bingo and specifically asked Megan to pass along a message saying how much she missed me. The sheer sociopathic ease with which she delivered that detailed lie was breathtaking. She was standing in the most romantic city in the world, drinking champagne funded by my money while spinning a heartwarming fairy tale about a woman she had drugged with animal sedatives and locked in a sweltering attic. Beside her, Cameron simply smiled and nodded in agreement, completely validating his wife's horrific fiction. I did not blink. I did not let my smile falter for a single fraction of a second. I looked back at the screen and thanked Megan for the update. I promised her the money would be wired to their dedicated account first thing Monday morning so Evelyn could continue receiving the absolute best care possible. Megan beamed, blowing a kiss to the camera before Cameron ended the call, saying they had to catch their dinner reservation. The screen went black. I sat in the suffocating silence of my living room. The fake smile dropped from my face, replaced by a cold, rigid mask of pure fury. I had just stared directly into the eyes of pure evil. I placed the phone down on the table, my mind calculating the precise legal and financial strikes I was about to execute. But before I could even formulate the first step, my phone rang again. This time it was a standard voice call. The caller ID showed Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was my primary legal counsel, a shark of a lawyer who had navigated my most aggressive corporate acquisitions back in the 80s. He was the only person who knew the full extent of my hidden wealth and the complex web of trusts I used to shield my assets. I picked up the phone expecting a routine update on some municipal bonds we were shifting. Jonathan did not bother with pleasantries. His voice was sharp, urgent, and entirely devoid of its usual calm demeanor. He asked me exactly where I was and told me I needed to get down to his downtown office immediately. I asked him what was wrong, assuming it had something to do with the nursing home trust account I had him monitoring. Jonathan paused, taking a heavy breath that echoed through the receiver. He told me he was running a routine quarterly audit on my declared personal assets when he hit a massive, glaring discrepancy. He informed me that exactly 3 weeks ago, a $200,000 home equity line of credit had been officially approved and fully dispersed. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked him which property the loan was attached to. Jonathan's voice dropped an octave. He told me the loan was secured against the very house I was sitting in right now, my modest suburban residence. He explained that the bank had processed the mortgage based on a set of heavily expedited legal documents. I told him that was impossible because I had never stepped foot in a bank or signed any loan applications in over a decade. Jonathan responded with a sentence that made the temperature in the room plummet. He said he had already pulled the digital copies of the loan origination paperwork from the county clerk office. The signature on the bottom line authorizing the $200,000 lien against my primary home was not a sloppy forgery. Jonathan said the signature perfectly flawlessly matched my own. My son had not just stolen his mother-in-law identity to fund a fake clinic. He had stolen my identity to mortgage the roof over my head. I did not waste a single second processing the shock. I grabbed my keys, walked out the front door, and drove straight to the financial district. Jonathan Pierce occupied the entire top floor of a sleek glass building, a fortress of mahogany desks, soundproof walls, and sharp legal minds. I bypassed the receptionist, ignoring her polite greetings, and walked directly into his private suite. Jonathan was already waiting for me, his suit jacket discarded and his tie loosened. Without saying a word, he slid a thick manila folder across the polished wooden surface of his desk. I opened it and stared at the loan origination documents. There it was in black and white. $200,000 borrowed against the equity of my modest suburban home. The signature at the bottom of the page was an absolute masterpiece of deception. It matched the exact curvature, the specific slant, and the unique spacing of my handwriting perfectly. A standard bank teller or a routine loan officer would never question its authenticity for a second. But I knew exactly how and when my son had obtained the perfect template to forge my identity. 2 months ago, Cameron had visited me on a Sunday afternoon. He brought over a box of expensive pastries and suggested we organize my old tax returns, claiming he wanted to help his aging father keep his financial house in order. I had played along flawlessly. I put on the mask of the tired, forgetful senior citizen, acting confused about which folders contained which documents. I intentionally left my private filing cabinet unlocked and completely unattended while I went into the kitchen to slowly brew a pot of tea. I gave him 20 uninterrupted minutes alone in my study. Cameron did not just organize my papers as a dutiful son. He meticulously photographed my most guarded legal signatures, scanned my original property deed, and copied my social security card. My own son used my manufactured vulnerability as a weapon to steal my identity. He viewed my quiet, peaceful retirement not as a well-earned rest, but as an opportunity for exploitation. I looked up from the forged document and met Jonathan's intense gaze. I confirmed it was Cameron handiwork, pointing out the slight hesitation in the ink at the end of my last name, a telltale sign of someone carefully tracing rather than signing naturally. Jonathan leaned back in his heavy leather chair and asked if I wanted him to contact the federal authorities immediately. Filing a police report for wire fraud and identity theft would freeze the loan instantly and put Cameron in handcuffs by nightfall. I firmly shook my head. Calling the police right now was far too quick and entirely too merciful. A sudden arrest would simply allow them to play the victims, hire expensive defense attorneys, and hide behind endless legal technicalities. I did not want a simple arrest or a swift judicial process. I wanted absolute, total annihilation of the life they had built on my dime. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the bustling city below, letting the cold memories of my past flood my mind. Jonathan knew better than anyone why I refused to call the cops. He had been my primary corporate counsel in the 1980s when I was building Mitchell Logistics from a single rusted delivery truck into a multi-state freight empire. Back then, the commercial transport industry was brutally unforgiving, especially for a young African-American man trying to break into a market dominated by old money and systemic prejudice. I faced racist bank managers who continuously denied my credit applications, hostile union bosses who threatened my drivers, and cutthroat white competitors who literally tried to run my trucks off the road to bankrupt me. I did not survive that vicious era by crying to the authorities or playing by the standard rules of fairness. I survived by smiling warmly at my enemies while secretly mapping out their entire supply chains. I used blind trusts and anonymous shell companies to quietly buy up their outstanding debts, and then I mercilessly foreclosed on their businesses overnight. I ruined arrogant men who thought they were completely untouchable, leaving them with absolutely nothing. I built my logistics empire with an iron fist, crushing anyone who mistook my silence for submission. When my beloved wife passed away, I deliberately buried that ruthless version of Mitchell Crawford. I wanted to be a gentle, supportive father to Cameron. I wanted to give him a life completely free from the brutal, degrading struggles I had to endure. But Cameron and Megan saw my gentle nature as an invitation to steal. They mistook a sleeping lion for a dead dog. I turned back to Jonathan, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, and told him to prepare the financial nets. We were not going to simply block the fraudulent mortgage. We were going to track every single asset they possessed, isolate them completely, and strip them of everything they valued. We would systematically dismantle their luxurious facade and watch them turn on each other in desperation. Jonathan nodded slowly, a predatory smile forming on his face. He loved this part of the job. He turned his attention back to the massive dual monitors on his desk, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he began to trace the digital footprint of the $200,000 dispersal. He explained that if Cameron had secured this fraudulent mortgage to cover his failing cosmetic clinic and the massive debts he accumulated using Evelyn's stolen identity, the funds should have been wired directly to commercial creditors or regional banks. But as Jonathan pulled up the routing sequence, his fingers suddenly froze over the keys. He stared at the screen, his eyes narrowing in absolute disbelief. He clicked through a complex maze of offshore banking portals and corporate registry databases following the electronic trail of the stolen money. After a tense, agonizing minute, he swiveled the monitor so I could see the glowing financial flow chart. The money had bypassed Cameron's personal and business accounts entirely. Not a single dime of the $200,000 went toward paying off his mounting medical clinic debts. Instead, the funds were wired through an obscure dummy corporation registered in Delaware and funneled directly into a private wealth management trust named Megan Heritage. Jonathan pulled up the official corporate filing for the trust and pointed a pen at the beneficiary line. The sole beneficiary and absolute controller of the trust was Megan. Cameron's name was completely absent from the document. He had absolutely zero legal access to the funds he had just committed federal wire fraud to obtain. The brilliance and sheer malice of the scheme hit me instantly, taking my breath away. Megan had manipulated her weak, greedy husband into mortgaging his own father house, risking decades in federal prison for identity theft. And then she quietly pocketed every single penny for herself. She was actively scamming her own husband right under his nose. She was building an untraceable financial exit strategy, preparing to take the stolen money and vanish, leaving Cameron holding the bag for the forged signatures, the massive corporate debts, and the abused, sedated mother locked in their attic. My daughter-in-law was playing a sociopathic game of chess against everyone around her, treating Cameron like a disposable pawn. I stood up from the mahogany desk, my blood running ice cold with a newfound terrifying clarity. Megan thought she was the smartest person in the room. She thought she had outsmarted her husband, her mother, and her elderly father-in-law. She was about to find out what happens when you try to con a man who literally wrote the playbook on corporate destruction. I looked at Jonathan and gave the first absolute order of our counteroffensive. We needed to cut the bleeding immediately and ruthlessly. I instructed him to instantly freeze the dedicated trust account responsible for the $10,000 monthly transfers. The fictional Silver Pines Nursing Home Fund was officially and permanently dead. I wanted that account locked down so tightly that if Megan tried to buy a simple coffee in Paris using that specific debit card, it would decline with a severe fraud alert. Let her experience the very first sting of her collapsing empire while sitting comfortably in a foreign country believing she was untouchable. Next, I told Jonathan to draft the official federal wire fraud report regarding the $200,000 home equity line of credit. I sat at his massive mahogany desk and used my favorite heavy fountain pen to sign the sworn affidavit detailing the exact parameters of the identity theft. Committing wire fraud across state and international lines carries a severe mandatory federal prison sentence, and I was going to ensure Cameron faced every single day of it. However, I gave Jonathan a very specific caveat. I wanted the federal report filed directly with a highly placed contact I knew inside the Financial Crimes Division. He was a man who owed me a significant favor from my corporate logistics days when I utilized my trucking network to help his agency track stolen freight. I needed the investigation officially opened and the heavy gears of the federal government grinding into motion, but I demanded absolute secrecy. There would be no loud knocks on Cameron's door just yet. No panic-inducing subpoenas sent to their luxury hotel in Paris. I wanted the federal agents to silently build an insurmountable mountain of rock-solid evidence while my son and his wife continued to drink expensive champagne, completely unaware of the legal avalanche forming right above their heads. The financial tourniquet was effectively applied, cutting off their primary oxygen supply. Now I needed to know exactly what Megan was planning before she boarded that international flight to France. I had to understand the full scope of her betrayal. Jonathan nodded in full agreement with my strategy and picked up his secure desk phone. Within 30 minutes, a man named Bradley Thorne walked into the office. Bradley was a high-end private investigator composed entirely of sharp angles and cold, unyielding efficiency. He was a former military intelligence officer who now specialized in corporate espionage and tracking hidden assets for the ultra-wealthy elite. He did not ask unnecessary questions, and he did not flinch when I explained the horrific severity of the situation regarding Evelyn and the stolen identity. I handed Bradley a thick dossier containing Megan's basic background information, her social media profiles, and her known financial habits. I told him I needed to know her exact movements for the entire 30 days prior to her departure for Paris. I explicitly stated that I did not care about her casual shopping trips or her pointless lunch dates with other wealthy housewives. I wanted to know where she went when she thought absolutely nobody was watching her. Bradley charged an exorbitant daily rate, but he delivered results with a terrifying speed that justified every single penny. I went back to the luxury downtown condominium where Evelyn was safely recovering. I sat in the quiet living room watching the city lights and resting my mind while Bradley agents methodically scoured the city grid. Less than 48 hours later, Bradley summoned me back to Jonathan's office. He bypassed all pleasantries and immediately projected his encrypted laptop screen onto the large wall monitor in the conference room. Bradley explained that Megan was highly disciplined in her deception. She never used her personal credit cards for anything remotely suspicious, and she meticulously kept her phone location services turned off during her unaccounted hours. But she was not an invisible ghost. Bradley had tracked her luxury sport utility vehicle using municipal traffic cameras and a hidden network of automated license plate readers. He mapped out a highly suspicious pattern of movement. Exactly 3 weeks ago, just a few days before Cameron forged my signature for the fraudulent mortgage, Megan had driven to the gritty industrial outskirts of the city. She parked her vehicle 3 blocks away from her actual destination and walked the rest of the way wearing a heavy trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat to obscure her face. Bradley's team had managed to pull security footage from a nearby pawn shop that perfectly captured her movements. She was extremely cautious, checking over her shoulder, walking quickly and deliberately, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone on the street. She was clearly protecting a massive secret and establishing the foundation for her ultimate exit strategy. Bradley paused the video feed and looked at me with a grim, hardened expression. He stated that she was not meeting a secret lover or buying illicit substances. She was actively securing the next highly illegal phase of her financial coup. Bradley clicked the next digital file and a high-definition security video began to play on the large monitor. The footage was obtained from the lobby of a discreet mid-tier hotel downtown, a place shady businessmen frequently used for illicit afternoon meetings. The camera clearly showed Megan walking into the lobby and taking a seat in a dimly lit corner booth far away from the main entrance. 10 minutes later, a tall, thin white man wearing an ill-fitting gray suit slid into the booth across from her. He looked incredibly nervous, constantly wiping sweat from his forehead and checking his surroundings. The security video had no audio, but the body language between the two was unmistakable. Megan was in complete, absolute control. She was dictating terms while the nervous man listened intently. She reached into her oversized designer bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. She slid it across the table and tapped her perfectly manicured finger against the cover, delivering what looked like a strict set of final instructions. The man quickly shoved the folder into his worn leather briefcase, nodded sharply, and practically sprinted out of the hotel lobby. I asked Bradley who the man was. Jonathan leaned forward, his face turning pale as he recognized the figure on the screen. Jonathan identified him immediately. His name was Gregory Hayes. He was a disgraced former attorney who had been quietly disbarred 5 years ago for extreme ethical violations and fraud. He operated exclusively in the shadows of the legal world, catering to desperate clients willing to pay exorbitant cash fees for highly illegal services. I asked Jonathan what exactly Gregory Hayes specialized in. Jonathan swallowed hard and looked me dead in the eyes. He stated that Gregory was the premier black market specialist for fabricating legally binding documents. He did not forge basic commercial contracts or simple bank loans. Gregory Hayes was infamous for drafting airtight fraudulent last wills and testaments. Megan was not just preparing to steal the home equity line of credit and run. She had hired a specialist to forge my death preparations, ensuring that when I inevitably passed away or was deemed incompetent, every single hidden asset I possessed would legally bypass my son and flow directly into her absolute control. Jonathan stared at the paused security footage of Gregory Hayes scurrying out of the hotel lobby. He picked up his secure desk phone and made 3 rapid calls to his underground network of courthouse clerks and paralegals. We sat in the heavy silence of the conference room waiting for the digital breadcrumbs to assemble into a coherent picture. 30 minutes later, Jonathan received an encrypted email. He opened the attached file and the blood completely drained from his face. He projected the document onto the large wall monitor. It was not a forged last will and testament. It was something far more insidious and immediate. It was a draft petition for a conservatorship. Megan and Cameron were aggressively building a fabricated legal case to declare me entirely lacking in mental capacity. The petition was filled with vicious, calculated lies portraying me as a deeply confused senior citizen suffering from advanced rapid-onset dementia. They detailed fabricated incidents of me wandering the streets at night forgetting my own name and mismanaging basic household finances. The sheer audacity of their plan was sickening. They were petitioning the state to strip me of all my civil rights and grant them absolute total legal control over my life. They were not waiting for me to die. They wanted to assume immediate power of attorney to breach the blind trusts of Mitchell Logistics. They planned to liquidate my hidden corporate empire, seize the assets, and permanently institutionalize me in a substandard psychiatric ward. They wanted to lock me away in a padded cell just like they had locked Evelyn in a sweltering attic. Megan had clearly orchestrated the entire strategy, utilizing Gregory Hayes to secure fraudulent physician signatures that would rubber stamp their conservatorship application. She was manipulating the legal system to effectively erase me from society. I looked at the projected document detailing the systematic theft of my freedom, and I felt a profound, icy calm settle over my mind. They had chosen the battlefield. They decided to play a high-stakes game of legal warfare against a man who spent the 1980s destroying hostile corporate raiders. I was going to let them build their fragile glass house, and then I was going to shatter it into a million pieces. I instructed Jonathan to immediately counter their offensive with overwhelming preemptive force. I refused to wait for a corrupt judge to review a pile of forged medical documents. I demanded undeniable, airtight proof of my supreme cognitive function. Jonathan spent the next 2 hours securing emergency appointments with 3 of the most prestigious, uncompromising, and heavily credentialed psychiatrists in the state. These were men and women who testified as expert witnesses in federal court and could never be bought or intimidated. Early the next morning, I walked into the first clinical evaluation. I brought a private videographer with me to record every single second of the grueling psychological examinations. I sat under the bright fluorescent lights of their sterile offices and answered every complex question thrown my way. They subjected me to rigorous memory retention tests, advanced spatial reasoning puzzles, and highly technical financial comprehension scenarios. I calculated compound interest in my head. I recounted specific dates, locations, and complex supply chain logistics from my corporate days with absolute flawless precision. I looked directly into the camera lenses while I dismantled their psychological assessments, proving my mind was as sharp and ruthless as it was 40 years ago. I completed all 3 comprehensive evaluations over a grueling 2-day period. The results were unanimous and definitive. Every single psychiatrist signed an ironclad sworn affidavit certifying that my mental acuity was exceptionally high and that I was in absolute perfect control of my cognitive faculties. Jonathan took the heavy stack of certified medical evaluations, the unedited high-definition video recordings, and the notarized affidavits, and sealed them in a heavily fortified legal vault. He drafted a preemptive counterpetition ready to be filed the very millisecond Cameron or Megan attempted to submit their fraudulent conservatorship claim. We essentially built a hidden legal landmine. When they inevitably walked into a courtroom and tried to present their fake doctor notes declaring me insane, Jonathan would drop a nuclear bomb of indisputable medical evidence right on their heads. They would instantly be facing severe charges of perjury and malicious prosecution. I walked out of Jonathan's office feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. I had effectively bulletproofed my mind and my assets against their sociopathic legal assault. I drove back to my quiet suburban house and parked in the driveway. Before I could even turn off the ignition, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in the cup holder. I glanced at the screen and saw Rosa's name flashing brightly. I answered the call immediately, sensing the sheer panic radiating through the receiver. Rosa was breathing heavily, her voice cracking with pure terror as she spoke in frantic, hurried sentences. She told me she was currently standing in the kitchen of my son's mansion and that Cameron had just called her directly from Paris. He did not sound like a man enjoying a luxurious European vacation. Rosa said his voice was erratic, rushed, and filled with a deep, desperate panic. Cameron ordered her to immediately drop whatever she was doing and drive to the nearest hardware store. He commanded her to buy industrial-strength bleach, heavy-duty scrub brushes, and clinical-grade deodorizers. He told her to go straight up to the unfinished attic and scrub every single inch of the wooden floorboards until they were spotless. Then Rosa repeated a sentence that made the temperature in my car drop to absolute zero. Cameron explicitly instructed her that if she happened to see a confused, senile old woman wandering around the upper floor, she was to physically push her back inside the attic lock, the heavy iron padlock, immediately, and under absolutely no circumstances call the police. He told Rosa the old woman was just crazy and that the family was handling it privately. Rosa was terrified, asking me what she should do. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying speed. Cameron and Megan were cutting their international trip short. Something had spooked them, likely a declined credit card or a blocked financial transfer from the account I had frozen. They were scrambling back to the United States to secure their stolen assets and destroy the evidence of their horrific abuse. They were coming home to cover their tracks, unaware that their prisoner was already gone and the hunter was patiently waiting in the dark. I gripped the steering wheel and told Rosa to buy the bleach and do exactly as he asked. The trap was finally set. I told Rosa to drive to the hardware store and buy exactly what Cameron demanded, but I explicitly ordered her not to touch a single floorboard in that attic until I gave the signal. I hung up the phone and immediately dialed Jonathan Pierce. I told him to deploy his private forensic investigation team to my son's mansion right this second. I wanted the space processed with the exact same rigorous methodology used for a high-level federal crime scene. Less than an hour later, an unmarked gray van pulled into the circular driveway. 4 men dressed in sterile white protective suits stepped out carrying heavy metallic equipment cases. I led them up the grand staircase and pointed to the shattered wooden door. They did not ask any questions. They went straight to work. For the next 3 hours, I stood silently in the pristine hallway watching them meticulously document the nightmare my daughter-in-law had created. They took hundreds of high-definition photographs capturing the suffocating heat, the complete lack of ventilation, and the heavy iron padlock resting on the hardwood floor. They bagged the filthy, stained mattress. They swabbed the wooden floorboards for chemical residue, mapping out exactly where the animal sedatives had spilled. They carefully collected the empty plastic water jug and the crushed box of cheap cookies. The lead investigator used specialized tweezers to gather stray hairs and broken fingernail clippings from the dark corners of the room. Every single microscopic fiber of evidence was sealed, labeled, and documented with a strict chain of custody protocol. I was building an ironclad, insurmountable criminal case for severe elder abuse, false imprisonment, and attempted manslaughter. When Cameron and Megan returned from Paris, they would find the attic smelling of industrial bleach and heavy lemon deodorizer just as they had frantically ordered. They would smile at each other, believing they had successfully scrubbed away their horrific sins. They would have absolutely no idea that their personal torture chamber had already been vacuumed of every trace of evidence and locked inside a secure legal vault. Once the forensic team loaded their van and departed, I finally gave Rosa the green light to clean the empty room. The physical trap was perfectly set. I left the suburban mansion and drove straight to the heavily guarded downtown condominium to check on Evelyn. When I unlocked the heavy reinforced door, the private nurse Sarah greeted me with a reassuring nod. She told me the intravenous fluids had worked wonders, and the veterinary sedatives were finally flushing out of her system. I walked into the sunlit bedroom and found Evelyn sitting upright against a pile of plush pillows. Her complexion was still frighteningly pale, but the primal terror I had seen in her eyes back in the attic was gone. When she saw me walk into the room, her chin quivered and tears immediately began to stream down her sunken cheeks. I pulled a chair to the side of her bed and took her fragile hand in mine. She squeezed my fingers and broke down weeping with a mixture of profound gratitude and overwhelming shame. She apologized repeatedly, saying she was so sorry for bringing this evil into my family. I told her in a firm, gentle voice that she had absolutely nothing to apologize for, and asked her to tell me exactly how this nightmare began. Evelyn took a shaky breath and recounted a story of systematic, calculated psychological warfare. 3 years ago, Megan began isolating her from her friends and extended family. Megan intercepted her mail, took over her banking passwords, and relentlessly battered her self-esteem until she completely surrendered her independence. Megan convinced Evelyn that her mind was failing and forced her to sign a comprehensive, durable power of attorney claiming it was strictly for emergency medical purposes. The very second the ink dried on that legal document, the mask completely fell off. Megan immediately drained her retirement accounts, maxed out her credit lines, and secured massive fraudulent loans. When Evelyn finally discovered the missing money and threatened to go to the police, Megan snapped. She drugged her own mother, dragged her unconscious body up the attic stairs, and locked the heavy oak door. Evelyn wept bitterly as she told me that Cameron knew absolutely everything. He was the one who sourced the animal tranquilizers from a corrupt supplier he met at his corporate job. He was the one who complained loudly about the cost of buying cheap cookies and bottled water to keep her alive while he drove a luxury sports car. I sat in stone-cold silence, listening to the gruesome details of my son, complete moral bankruptcy. Evelyn cried that she had raised a monster. I squeezed her hand and promised her that justice was coming rapidly, and it would be absolutely merciless. Evelyn leaned back against the pillows, looking entirely physically exhausted, but there was a sudden fierce intensity burning in her eyes. She gripped my wrist with a surprising burst of strength, refusing to let me pull away. She told me there was one more thing I needed to know, something she had overheard through the thin wooden floorboards of the attic, while Megan thought she was heavily sedated. Evelyn lowered her voice to a harsh whisper and told me that Megan had been playing Cameron for an absolute fool since the very first day they met. Megan despised my son, viewing him as weak, pathetic, and easily manipulated. She only married him because she had hired a private investigator to dig into my background years ago. She discovered the massive hidden logistics empire, the blind trusts, and the multi-million-dollar assets. She truly believed Cameron was the sole key to unlocking my entire fortune. Then Evelyn dropped a bombshell that completely shifted the gravitational pull of the entire room. She told me the highly celebrated pregnancy Megan had been flaunting to everyone was a complete, calculated lie. Cameron had been boasting for weeks about becoming a father, but Evelyn had listened to Megan pacing the hallway right below the attic, laughing on the phone with another man. It was Gregory Hayes, the disgraced black market lawyer she had met at the downtown hotel. Evelyn heard Megan explicitly assure Gregory that the child she was carrying was entirely his. She was using the fake paternity to permanently trap Cameron, legally force accelerated payouts from the family trust funds, and then eventually discard him in a brutal divorce settlement once she secured the ultimate payout. My son had mortgaged his own father's house, poisoned his soul, and committed heinous federal crimes for a woman who was actively carrying another man's child. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. Megan had crafted an intricate sociopathic masterpiece to steal my legacy, but she had fundamentally miscalculated the ending. She thought she was maneuvering against a weak, gullible family. She had no idea she had just handed the executioner the final nail for her own coffin. Cameron and Megan landed at the international airport just before twilight. I knew their exact flight itinerary because my private investigator had been tracking their every movement since they hastily booked their return tickets from Paris. They were rushing back in a state of blind panic to secure their stolen assets and ensure their horrific secret was still safely hidden away in the sweltering darkness of the attic. I decided to greet them with a grand, disarming gesture. I organized a lavish welcome-home dinner right inside the formal dining room of their sprawling suburban mansion. Technically, it was my mansion since my anonymous holding company held the deed, but they were completely oblivious to that crucial legal fact. I arrived 2 hours before their scheduled arrival and brought an extravagant spread of catered food from the absolute finest steakhouse in the city. I set the heavy mahogany table with their imported crystal glasses, their polished silver cutlery, and lit expensive candles to create the ultimate illusion of domestic bliss. I wanted the setting to be absolutely picture-perfect, a flawless stage for the final act of their tragic play. The entire house smelled of rich roasted garlic butter, seared filet mignon, and truffle mashed potatoes. That rich, savory aroma completely masked the faint, lingering chemical scent of the industrial bleach Rosa had used to violently scrub the attic floorboards upstairs. I sat at the head of the long table, sipping a glass of sparkling water and waiting in the absolute silence of the grand house. I felt a cold, predatory focus settle over my entire body. I thought about Evelyn shivering on that filthy mattress, clutching a box of cheap, stale cookies, while these two monsters lived like royalty. When I heard the heavy front door finally swing open, the sound of their designer luggage rolling across the Italian marble foyer echoed loudly through the house. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the sharp, ruthless titan of the logistics industry retreat into the shadows for just a few more minutes, and firmly pulling the familiar mask of the tired, aging father back over my face. Megan walked into the dining room first, and the sheer audacity of her appearance almost made me laugh out loud. She was draped in expensive European couture, but the undeniable centerpiece of her ensemble was a brand-new, immaculate leather handbag draped proudly over her forearm. It was a highly exclusive status symbol that cost more than what most hardworking families earned in an entire year. It was clearly purchased with the money Cameron had stolen by forging my signature on that $200,000 home equity loan. Cameron followed closely behind her, dragging the heavy suitcases, looking entirely exhausted and visibly sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning in the house. His eyes darted nervously toward the high ceiling, specifically toward the hidden attic door, but he forced a wide, unnatural smile when he saw me sitting peacefully at the dining table. Megan immediately launched into her highly rehearsed performance. She walked over and gave me a stiff, theatrical hug, carefully avoiding crushing her pristine silk blouse. She dramatically sighed, complaining about the brutal jet lag and how absolutely exhausting it was to shop in the crowded Parisian boutiques. I simply smiled, nodded, and urged them to sit down and enjoy the hot gourmet meal I had prepared for their arrival. They eagerly took their seats, pouring themselves generous glasses of heavy, expensive red wine. As we began to eat, Megan wasted absolutely no time laying the psychological groundwork for her fraudulent conservatorship plot. She rested her elbows on the polished table, leaned forward, and put on a sickeningly sweet mask of manufactured concern. She tilted her head and asked me in a high-pitched, condescending tone if I had managed to drive to their house all by myself without getting lost. Before I could even answer, she softly patted my hand and asked if I was experiencing any recent confusion on the road. She casually mentioned that she had noticed I was becoming increasingly forgetful lately, and suggested that my memory was rapidly slipping away. She asked if I remembered to lock my own front door or if I was forgetting to pay my utility bills on time. Cameron chimed in right on cue, perfectly playing the role of the deeply devoted and worried son. He set his crystal wine glass down and told me that severe cognitive decline was perfectly natural for a man my age. He said they were just trying to look out for my best interests and heavily implied that living completely alone was becoming far too dangerous for my physical safety. He boldly suggested that it might be time for me to surrender legal control of my daily finances, so I would not accidentally bankrupt myself in a state of senile confusion. They were actively gaslighting me right to my face, flawlessly executing the exact legal strategy the black market lawyer had outlined for them. They were aggressively building a verbal narrative to justify locking me in a psychiatric ward and seizing my hidden empire. I listened to every single insulting lie they spun with perfect composure. I observed the way Megan lovingly touched her completely flat stomach, subtly reminding Cameron of the fake pregnancy that was secretly fathered by another man. I watched my son nod along with her vicious deceit, entirely willing to sell his own father into an asylum just to maintain his pathetic illusion of a wealthy lifestyle. I chewed my food slowly, maintaining a blank, pleasant expression, giving them all the rope they needed to hang themselves. The extravagant meal continued with Megan boasting loudly about the private boat tours on the river and the diamond earrings Cameron had bought her. The atmosphere in the dining room was thick with their suffocating arrogance. They truly believed they were the smartest people on earth, sitting untouchable on top of an insurmountable mountain of stolen wealth. I let the silence stretch for a long, deliberate moment, allowing the ambient sound of the central air conditioning to fill the void. I carefully placed my heavy silver fork down on the porcelain plate and wiped my mouth with a crisp linen napkin. I folded my hands together and rested them on the polished mahogany table, shifting my posture just slightly. The tired, confused old man completely vanished from my eyes, replaced by the cold, unyielding stare of a corporate executioner who had destroyed men twice their size. I looked directly across the table, locking my gaze onto Megan's perfectly contoured face. I spoke in a low, calm, and absolutely terrifyingly steady voice. I told her that I had a rather confusing afternoon while they were flying back home. I mentioned that the weather was beautiful, so I decided to take a long, leisurely drive across town. I leaned forward just an inch and told her that I stopped by the Silver Pines luxury nursing home to drop off some fresh flowers for Evelyn. The clinking of silverware instantly stopped. Cameron froze, completely paralyzed, with his wine glass hovering halfway to his mouth. Megan's posture went completely rigid, her fake, sweet smile freezing on her face like a cracked porcelain doll. I maintained my relentless eye contact, not allowing her to look away, and continued speaking in that same quiet, measured tone. I told her that the facility administrators were incredibly polite, but they were entirely baffled by my visit. I watched the blood rapidly drain from Megan's face, turning her tan complexion an ashen, sickly gray. Her breathing hitched visibly. I stated very clearly that the senior director of Silver Pines informed me they had no record of an Evelyn ever being admitted to their care. They thoroughly checked their current residential rosters, their past archives, and their financial ledgers. She had never been a resident there for a single day. I tilted my head, mimicking the exact condescending gesture Megan had used on me just 10 minutes prior. I looked back and forth between my profusely sweating son and my hyperventilating daughter-in-law. I asked them very simply and very quietly where exactly the $240,000 I had personally wired to them over the past 2 years had gone. The silence in the dining room became incredibly dense. The clinking of expensive silverware halted completely. Megan's face lost all its vibrant color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles turned white. For a fleeting second, pure, unadulterated terror flashed in her eyes. But Megan was a master manipulator. She quickly scrambled to rebuild her shattered facade, drawing upon the narrative they had just been pushing. She let out a high-pitched, forced laugh that sounded entirely hollow and devoid of any real amusement. She waved her hand dismissively in the air and shook her head with exaggerated sympathy. She told me I must have simply gone to the wrong address or spoken to the wrong receptionist. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with that sickening fake sweetness, and insisted that my memory was clearly failing me again. She said the facility had recently changed ownership, and perhaps their records were just undergoing a digital migration. She looked at Cameron, expecting him to back up her desperate lie. But my son was falling apart right in front of me. Cameron was sweating profusely. Large drops of moisture beaded on his forehead and upper lip, catching the warm glow of the expensive dining candles. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly as he stared down at his half-eaten filet mignon. He could not even bring himself to look me in the eye. Megan kicked him sharply under the table. He jolted upright and stammered out a pathetic agreement. He muttered that I was probably just confused by the large, sprawling campus at Silver Pines and that they would gladly drive me there themselves next week when I was feeling more lucid. They were actively doubling down on the gaslighting, attempting to bury my discovery under a mountain of fake concern for my mental health. Megan adjusted her designer blouse and tried to steer the conversation back to safe territory. She casually reached for her wine glass, attempting to project absolute confidence. She told me I really needed to stop driving alone because my delusions were becoming a serious liability to my physical safety. She was actively trying to convince me that the truth I had uncovered was nothing more than a symptom of a diseased, decaying mind. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or defend my cognitive abilities. Arguing with a liar only gives their lies oxygen, and I was entirely finished playing their twisted games. Instead, I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I placed it gently on the center of the dining table, right next to the glowing, expensive centerpiece. I tapped the screen once, opening the audio file I had recorded just a few days ago in that sweltering, horrific wooden cage. I pressed play and maximized the volume. The crystal-clear acoustics of their luxurious dining room amplified the sound perfectly. The recording began with the heavy, unmistakable crunch of my crowbar smashing against their iron padlock. Cameron flinched violently at the noise as if he had been physically struck. Then a voice filled the room. It was not a loud voice, but it carried a weight that completely suffocated the space. It was Evelyn. Her raspy, broken whimpering echoed off the imported Italian marble walls. The audio captured her terrified, breathless pleas with agonizing clarity. "Please do not tell Megan I ate the cookies. I am sorry for making a mess. If she finds out I am making noise, she will tie me up again." The sound of her weeping, a fragile elderly woman begging for basic human mercy, stood in stark, nauseating contrast to the lavish feast spread out before us. I watched their faces closely as the recording played. The forced smile completely melted off Megan's face, replaced by a mask of raw, naked panic. The illusion of the sophisticated, wealthy socialite was instantly incinerated by the undeniable proof of her monstrous cruelty. She stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake coiled on her dining table. Cameron looked genuinely physically ill. The color drained entirely from his face, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. The recording continued, broadcasting Evelyn horrific reality detailing the bucket in the corner, the animal sedatives, and the unbearable heat of their unfinished attic. I sat perfectly still, observing the absolute destruction of their arrogant facade. I let the audio run its full course, ensuring they heard every single agonizing second of their victim pain. When the recording finally clicked off, the silence that followed was absolute and deafening. There were no more excuses about mixed-up addresses or administrative errors. There was no more talk of my declining mental health. The undeniable truth hung heavily in the air, trapping them entirely in their own web of deceit. They were completely cornered, and they knew it. Cameron was the first one to break. The sheer crushing pressure of the exposure shattered his pathetic composure into pieces. He pushed his heavy wooden dining chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed loudly against the hardwood floor. He stood up completely frantic, running his trembling hands over his sweating face. His eyes darted wildly around the room as panic fully consumed him. He looked at me with an expression of sheer terror and blurted out the exact words that legally cemented his guilt. He asked me in a high, panicked pitch if I had gone up into the attic. He did not ask how Evelyn was doing. He did not attempt to deny the accusations or act confused. His immediate reaction was sheer horror that his secret torture chamber had been breached. By asking that specific question, my son verbally confessed to knowing exactly where his mother-in-law was hidden all along. Megan, however, reacted entirely differently. The moment Cameron exposed their mutual guilt, her panic instantly morphed into a vicious, feral rage. She dropped the sweet, caring daughter-in-law act completely. Her true nature, a cornered, vicious predator, bared its teeth. She slammed her hands down on the table, making the crystal wine glasses rattle dangerously. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated malice. She screamed that I had absolutely no right to be snooping around her property while they were out of the country. She yelled that I was an invasive, crazy old man who had illegally broken into her private residence. She completely ignored the horrifying reality of what she had done to her own mother and immediately shifted to an aggressive, offensive strategy. She told me I had committed a serious crime by destroying the padlock and entering a restricted area of her home. She grabbed her smartphone from the table and threatened to call the police right that very second. She sneered and confidently declared that she was going to have me arrested and thrown into a jail cell for breaking and entering. She genuinely believed her name was on the deed to the mansion. She believed she held the ultimate authority and that the law would protect her property rights over a trespassing senior citizen. She stood tall, crossing her arms and demanding I leave her house immediately before she had me dragged out in handcuffs. Megan stood there with her chest heaving and her perfectly manicured finger still pointing directly at my face. She waited for me to crumble. She fully expected the frail and forgetful old man to panic at the threat of law enforcement and beg for her mercy. Instead, a sound escaped my throat that completely froze the room. It started low like a deep rumble in my chest and rapidly grew into a loud, cold, and utterly humorless laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had spent decades destroying corporate titans. A sound my son had never heard from his gentle father, and a sound my daughter-in-law was completely unprepared for. Cameron took a cautious step back, his eyes widening as he stared at me in sheer horror. The supreme arrogance radiating from Megan began to waver, replaced by a flickering shadow of genuine confusion. She demanded to know what was so funny, her voice losing its authoritative edge and pitching upward in panic. I did not stop smiling. That cold, predatory smile remained fixed on my face as I slowly reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I did not pull out a plea for forgiveness or a confused excuse. I pulled out a thick, crisply folded legal document bearing the official raised seal of the county clerk office. I laid it flat on the mahogany dining table, smoothing out the creases with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I tapped my index finger against the heavy parchment, the sharp sound echoing loudly in the silent room. I told her to look very closely at the paper before she made another threat she could not afford to execute. Megan hesitated, glancing at Cameron, who was too paralyzed by fear to intervene. She snatched the document from the table, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. I watched her pupils dart back and forth across the page, absorbing the undeniable reality printed in black and white. The document was the master property deed for the sprawling $1.5 million suburban mansion we were currently standing inside. Megan read the primary ownership line, and her breath caught sharply in her throat. The color that had momentarily returned to her cheeks vanished once again, leaving her looking like a ghost. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and let my voice slice through the heavy air like a razor. I asked her to repeat what she had just said. I asked her to clarify if she truly and genuinely believed that this magnificent piece of real estate was her house. Megan stared at the deed, her mouth opening and closing silently. I did not give her a chance to formulate another lie. I unleashed the brutal, unfiltered truth they had been hiding from for years. I asked her how on earth she ever convinced herself that a mid-level sales manager and a completely unemployed socialite could qualify for $1 million mortgage. I told her the absolute truth about their pathetic financial reality. Cameron was a mediocre employee, barely clinging to a middle management job, making just enough to cover his expensive car lease and his tailored suits. Megan contributed absolutely zero income to their household, spending her days pretending to be a wealthy aristocrat while maxing out credit cards she could not pay off. I told them they were nothing but glamorous parasites, living entirely in a financial fantasy I had secretly funded from the very beginning. The deed she held in her trembling hands did not bear Cameron's name, and it certainly did not bear hers. The property was fully owned free and clear by a corporate holding entity called Mitchell Logistics, LLC. It was a direct subsidiary of the massive freight empire I had built from the ground up with my own blood and sweat while fighting off ruthless competitors in the 1980s. I informed her that I was the sole proprietor, the absolute owner, and the ultimate legal authority over every single square inch of this property. They were not homeowners. They were merely temporary guests living in my house on my charity. I explained that I did not commit breaking and entering when I destroyed that heavy iron padlock on the attic door. I was simply inspecting my own real estate. I was uncovering the horrific, nauseating crime scene they had built under my roof. Cameron finally found his voice, letting out a pathetic, whining whimper. He begged me to listen, claiming he thought I bought the house as a permanent gift for them, establishing a foundation for their future family. I turned my sharp gaze to my son, feeling nothing but absolute disgust. I told him a real man provides his own foundation. A real man does not lock his mother-in-law in a sweltering, urine-soaked attic, drug her with animal tranquilizers, and steal her identity to fund his pathetic failures. I told Cameron he was a weak, spineless coward who allowed a manipulative, sociopathic woman to turn him into a federal criminal. Megan dropped the deed onto the table as if it had burned her fingers. The illusion of her supreme authority was completely shattered. She realized she had absolutely no legal standing to kick me out, no ground to stand on, and no wealth to claim as her own. She was standing in a house she did not own, wearing clothes she bought with stolen money, caught red-handed in a massive criminal conspiracy. Just as the crushing weight of their reality settled over the dining room, a sharp, piercing sound shattered the tense silence. It started as a faint wail in the distance, but rapidly grew louder, echoing aggressively through the quiet suburban streets. The undeniable, high-pitched scream of approaching police sirens cut through the night air. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the large bay windows of the dining room, casting erratic, frantic shadows across the imported Italian marble floors. Megan suddenly threw her head back and let out a loud, triumphant, and entirely unhinged cackle. The shock of the property deed had temporarily broken her, but the sound of the sirens reignited her vicious, manipulative core. She glared at me, her eyes completely wild, and proudly announced that I was too late. She stepped back from the table, revealing a small, discreet security remote clutched tightly in her palm. She boasted that the moment I started playing that audio recording of her mother, she had silently pressed the panic button hidden under the dining table. She sneered, her face twisting into a grotesque mask of victory, and told me that the police were not here for her. She boldly declared that she was going to tell the arriving officers I was a violent, delusional old man who had broken into the house, threatened them, and suffered a severe psychotic break. She told me to get ready because I was going straight to a jail cell for harassment, and from there directly to a locked psychiatric ward. She laughed again, completely convinced that her white female tears would easily manipulate the police into arresting an elderly African-American man standing in a wealthy neighborhood. The sirens stopped abruptly right in the driveway, followed immediately by the sound of heavy boots sprinting up the front steps. Cameron stood frozen, too terrified to speak, watching his wife orchestrate her final desperate lie. Megan rushed toward the foyer, tears of fake trauma already forming in her eyes, preparing to play the ultimate victim for the authorities. Before she could even reach the entryway, the heavy front door was violently kicked open, slamming hard against the interior wall. A team of uniformed police officers stormed into the house, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, scanning the room for the immediate threat. Megan immediately pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at me, ready to seal my fate. The heavy wooden door slammed against the interior wall as 4 uniformed police officers flooded into the dining room. Their hands rested instinctively on their duty belts as their eyes scanned the chaotic scene. Megan did not waste a single second. She immediately launched into an Oscar-worthy performance that would have fooled anyone who did not know the dark, rotting truth behind her flawless exterior. Tears began to stream down her face in perfect, crystalline drops. She let out a terrified, manufactured sob and pointed her trembling finger directly at my chest. She cried out to the officers, telling them I was a dangerous, unstable man who had suffered a severe psychotic break. She claimed I broke into her home, destroyed her property with a crowbar, and cornered them in the dining room with violent intentions. She wrapped her arms protectively around her flat stomach, playing the ultimate trump card. She begged the officers to protect her and her unborn child from a deranged senior citizen. She pleaded with them to tackle me to the ground and put me in handcuffs before I could hurt her family. Cameron stood frozen behind her, nodding his head in rapid, pathetic agreement. He stammered out a few broken sentences, telling the police I had a history of dementia and needed to be institutionalized immediately. I stood perfectly still at the head of the mahogany table. I did not raise my hands in surrender. I did not shout over her hysterical crying to defend my character. I simply watched her utilize her privilege as a weapon, fully expecting the officers to blindly trust the tears of a wealthy, well-dressed white woman standing in a luxury suburban mansion. She genuinely believed her manufactured victimhood was an impenetrable shield. She thought the sight of an older African-American man standing in her dining room would trigger an automatic aggressive response from the authorities. She kept screaming for them to arrest me, demanding they take me away in chains. The officers spread out across the room, assessing the situation with trained, cautious eyes. The tension in the air was absolute, thick enough to slice with a knife. Megan took a step backward, pretending to cower in fear, sobbing loudly into her hands, waiting for the inevitable moment the police would violently tackle me to the hardwood floor. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered police captain with silver hair and a stern expression, stepped forward. He walked right past the tipped-over dining chair and the expensive crystal wine glasses. Megan reached out her hand toward him, expecting to be comforted and protected. Instead, the captain gently but firmly pushed her pointing finger aside. He completely ignored her theatrical sobbing. He walked straight up to the head of the table where I was standing, perfectly composed. He stopped, looked me directly in the eyes, and offered a highly respectful nod. He asked me in a calm, professional tone if I was unharmed, Mr. Crawford. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit jacket, nodded once, and told him I was perfectly fine. Megan choked on her fake tears. Her mouth fell open in absolute disbelief. She stared at the captain, her brain completely failing to process why the police were not treating me like a dangerous intruder. She shrieked at the captain, asking him what he was doing and demanding again that he arrest me for breaking and entering. The captain turned around slowly and faced my daughter-in-law. He looked at her with a cold, deeply disgusted expression. He informed her that they were not responding to the silent panic alarm she had pressed under the dining table. He stated that the panic button activation simply coincided with a highly coordinated, pre-planned federal raid. He explained that my legal counsel, Jonathan Pierce, and agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation had thoroughly briefed his department hours ago. The local precinct had already received the massive digital file containing the audio recordings, the forensic photographs from the attic, and the undeniable proof of the fraudulent home equity loan. The captain reached into his heavy utility vest and pulled out a thick folded stack of legal warrants bearing the official seal of a federal judge. He looked directly at Megan and then at my sweating, trembling son. He announced in a booming, authoritative voice that Megan and Cameron Crawford were officially under arrest. He did not rush through the charges. He read them slowly and deliberately, ensuring every single word echoed through their luxurious dining room. He listed felony elder abuse. He listed aggravated false imprisonment. He listed identity theft and conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud. The illusion of their untouchable wealth shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. Megan's face went from a mask of fake terror to an expression of genuine, absolute devastation. Her legs gave out slightly and she stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the dining table. 2 officers immediately moved in. They grabbed her arms, pulling them roughly behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Cameron tried to back away, raising his hands in a weak, pathetic gesture of surrender. Another officer grabbed him by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him against the wall to secure his cuffs. I stood tall, watching the 2 arrogant monsters who had tortured an innocent woman and attempted to steal my entire legacy get treated exactly like the common violent criminals they truly were. The crushing weight of reality finally crashed down on Cameron's shoulders. The cold steel pinching his wrists completely broke whatever miserable shred of dignity he had left. He looked at the uniformed officers swarming his dining room. He looked at his wife fighting against the handcuffs. Then he looked at me, the arrogant, demanding son who had tried to gaslight me into a psychiatric ward just 20 minutes ago, completely vanished. He fell to his knees on the imported Italian marble floor, weeping hysterically like a terrified child. The sound of his sobbing was pathetic and loud, filling the entire house. He dragged his knees across the floor, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. He begged me to save him. He screamed out that he was my only son and pleaded with me to call my lawyers to stop the arrest. He cried that he did not want to go to federal prison. In his absolute desperation, Cameron did exactly what cowards always do when they are cornered. He violently threw his partner under the bus. He yelled at the top of his lungs that he never wanted to hurt Evelyn. He screamed that Megan forced him to do it. He told the police that Megan came up with the entire plan, that she manipulated him into securing the animal sedatives, and that she was the one who locked her own mother in the attic. He begged me to believe that he was just a victim of her sociopathic greed. Megan completely snapped. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy marriage instantly evaporated, replaced by a vicious, feral hatred. She twisted violently in the grip of the police officer, her face turning dark red with pure rage. She lunged toward Cameron, completely ignoring the officers holding her back. She screamed at him, calling him a weak, pathetic, worthless loser. She spat venom across the room, exposing every single one of his crimes directly to the police. She yelled that Cameron was a greedy failure who gladly stole his mother-in-law identity to pay off his miserable debts. She screamed that he was the one who bought the drugs, and that he happily forged his own father's signature because he was too incompetent to earn his own money. She viciously mocked his tears, telling the officers that he was fully aware of every single agonizing second Evelyn spent in that attic. I stood at the head of the table, watching them tear each other apart like rabid animals. They were doing the prosecution job for them, loudly confessing to multiple federal crimes in a room full of police officers. They thought they were a brilliant criminal masterminds, but under the slightest bit of pressure, they instantly destroyed each other. I looked down at Megan as she continued to scream about her fake pregnancy, trying to use the unborn child as a final desperate shield against the police. I took a deep breath, ready to deliver the final, absolute crushing blow that would completely obliterate her last remaining lie. I watched the 2 of them thrash against the heavy steel handcuffs, spitting venom and tearing their marriage apart piece by piece. The uniformed officers stood by like silent stone sentinels, allowing them to confess every single miserable detail of their conspiracy. I raised my hand slightly, and the room immediately fell silent. I walked slowly toward the center of the dining room, my polished shoes clicking sharply against the imported marble floor. Cameron was still kneeling, his face heavily stained with tears and sweat, looking up at me with the pathetic, fragile hope of a cornered rat. He mumbled another weak apology, claiming he only did what he had to do to keep their lives from falling apart. I did not offer him a single ounce of pity. I reached into the sleek leather briefcase I had placed on the side table earlier that evening. I pulled out a thick stack of federal banking documents bound tightly in a stark red folder. I tossed the heavy file directly onto the floor right in front of Cameron kneeling form. The crisp white papers slid out across the marble, displaying the exact loan origination documents for the $200,000 home equity line of credit. I pointed down at the signature line where my name was perfectly, flawlessly forged. I told my son that his attempted identity theft was truly a masterpiece of deception. I recounted how he had sat in my study pretending to care about my tax returns while meticulously scanning my private deeds and copying my signature. I made sure every police officer in the room heard the exact federal statutes he had violated. I explained that wire fraud and forging a signature to leverage a massive commercial loan against a property he did not own carried a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. Cameron stared at the documents on the floor, his chest heaving with rapid panic. He tried to justify his ultimate treason. He cried out that his cosmetic clinic was failing, that Evelyn credit was maxed out, and that he desperately needed the $200,000 to pay off the aggressive commercial creditors breathing down his neck. He sobbed that it was a temporary emergency loan and he was going to pay me back before I ever noticed the massive lien on my house. A harsh, bitter laugh escaped my lips, echoing loudly against the high ceilings of the mansion. I looked down at my own flesh and blood and felt nothing but profound, absolute pity for his staggering ignorance. I asked Cameron if he honestly believed a single penny of that $200,000 went toward paying his mounting business debts. His sobbing abruptly stopped. He looked up at me, his tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure confusion. He glanced over his shoulder at Megan, who suddenly stopped struggling against the police officers. Her face drained of color once again, her eyes darting frantically toward the front door. I told my son to look at the second page of the banking file scattered on the floor. I instructed him to read the routing numbers and the final destination of the dispersed funds. Cameron awkwardly shuffled on his knees, his cuffed hands unable to reach the papers, but his eyes scanned the bold black text. I narrated the complex financial trail for him, detailing how the stolen money entirely bypassed his personal accounts and his failing clinic. I explained that the funds were instantly funneled through a dummy corporation in Delaware and wired directly into a private wealth management trust. I read the name of the trust out loud, making sure the words hit him like a physical blow: Megan Heritage. I watched the realization slowly, agonizingly dawn on Cameron's face. I told him that his wife had actively scammed him right under his nose. She manipulated him into committing massive federal fraud, risking decades of his life in a maximum security prison, and then she silently pocketed every single dime for herself. I informed him that the official corporate filing for the trust listed Megan as the sole absolute beneficiary. Cameron's name was nowhere on the document. He had absolutely zero legal access to the fortune he had just destroyed his own father to obtain. Megan was building a completely untraceable financial exit strategy, preparing to take the stolen cash and vanish, leaving him alone to face the forged signatures, the crippling corporate debts, and the horrific abuse of her mother in the attic. My son had sold his soul, betrayed the father who raised him, and mortgaged his own future for a woman who treated him like a highly disposable pawn. Cameron let out a guttural, agonizing sound of pure heartbreak and fury. He had thrown away his entire family and his freedom for absolutely nothing. He was left completely empty-handed, a pathetic puppet played perfectly by a sociopathic puppeteer. Megan realized her ultimate safety net had just been incinerated. The offshore accounts, the hidden trust funds, and the carefully planned escape route were all frozen and heavily documented by federal authorities. Her entire sociopathic chess game was completely dismantled in front of an audience of armed police officers. She had absolutely no leverage left, no money to hire expensive defense attorneys, and no more lies to spin. The police captain signaled to his officers, instructing them to escort the prisoners out to the waiting patrol cars. 2 officers firmly gripped Megan's arms, pulling her forcefully toward the front door. The reality of a cold concrete jail cell finally shattered her arrogant delusion. Backed entirely into a corner, the vicious predator inside her unleashed its final desperate weapon. She thrashed violently against the officers, digging her designer heels into the marble floor and refusing to walk. She twisted her body around and fixed her manic, burning eyes directly on me. She screamed with a completely unhinged, terrifying ferocity. She knew she had lost the money and the mansion, but she believed she still held one supreme, undeniable claim over my legacy. She yelled that if I let these officers drag her away, I would be making the biggest mistake of my miserable life. Her voice cracked, echoing shrilly through the grand foyer as she threw her ultimate trump card onto the table. She screamed that if I sent her to federal prison, I would never, ever get to see my own grandchild. She puffed out her chest, straining against the heavy steel handcuffs, and proudly declared that the baby growing inside her belly was my direct bloodline. She shrieked that her unborn child was the one and only true legal heir to the massive Mitchell Logistics fortune. She wildly threatened that she would ensure I died a lonely, miserable old man, never allowed to hold the next generation of my family. She glared at me with absolute triumph, genuinely convinced that the undeniable biological pull of a grandchild would force me to instantly drop the charges and beg for her mercy. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the hysterical woman thrashing against the police officers. The dining room was completely silent, aside from her shrill, desperate breathing. I looked directly into her wild, calculating eyes and repeated the word, grandchild, allowing the sheer absurdity of the concept to hang heavily in the air. I told her that she severely underestimated the thoroughness of the private intelligence operatives I kept on my payroll. When I hired Bradley Thorne to track her movements, he did not just take high-definition photographs of her illicit hotel meetings. He also collected physical evidence. I explained that while she was sitting in that dimly lit lobby negotiating forged legal documents with a disgraced black market lawyer, she left a half-empty glass of sparkling water on the table. My investigator carefully bagged that glass, securing her saliva and DNA. Meanwhile, I had easily retrieved a few strands of hair from Cameron Hairbrush right here in this very house. I reached into my tailored jacket pocket one final time and pulled out a certified laboratory report from one of the most prestigious private medical testing facilities in the state. I held the crisp white paper up so she could clearly see the bright red official stamps of authentication. I told her the initial goal was simply to prove the child she was carrying was fathered by another man, a suspicion Evelyn had tearfully shared with me from her horrific confinement in the attic. But the forensic laboratory discovered something far more fascinating. I read the medical conclusion out loud, ensuring my voice projected clearly to every single police officer standing in the foyer. The comprehensive blood and saliva analysis confirmed there were absolutely zero trace levels of human chorionic gonadotropin, the primary hormone required to sustain a viable pregnancy. I stared down at her and delivered the ultimate crushing truth. She was not pregnant. She had never been pregnant. There was no heir to the Mitchell Logistics fortune. I laid out the entirety of her sickening sociopathic fabrication. The glossy ultrasound printouts she had proudly passed around during our family dinners, the morning sickness she expertly faked, and the extravagant nursery she demanded Cameron finance were all entirely fabricated. I told her my investigators had traced the exact digital footprint of her laptop, uncovering the dark web marketplace where she purchased customized fake ultrasound images for $300. She manufactured a completely fictitious unborn child for one specific calculated purpose: to emotionally manipulate her weak husband into moving faster to force an early, highly accelerated payout from the family trust funds. She weaponized the sacred concept of motherhood to execute a federal financial heist. The absolute finality of my words struck Megan with the force of a speeding freight train. The fierce, feral defiance that had fueled her hysterical screaming instantly evaporated, leaving nothing but a hollow, empty shell. The vibrant, arrogant spark in her eyes died out completely, replaced by a vast, bottomless void of sheer terror. Her knees simply gave out beneath her. The uniformed officers holding her arms had to brace their stances to keep her from collapsing entirely, but she still sank heavily toward the imported Italian marble floor. The heavy steel handcuffs clinked sharply against her designer jewelry, a pathetic, harsh reminder of her new reality. Megan lost every single layer of her carefully constructed aristocratic armor. The sophisticated, wealthy white socialite who had endlessly mocked my working-class background was entirely gone. She was reduced to a miserable, shivering fraud kneeling in the ruins of her own catastrophic lies. She opened her mouth to speak, to formulate one last desperate excuse, but her vocal cords completely failed her. Only a pathetic, raspy wheeze escaped her throat. She looked frantically around the grand foyer, searching the stern faces of the police officers for even a microscopic shred of pity or doubt. She found absolutely nothing but intense, unyielding disgust. They stared down at her with the kind of revulsion usually reserved for the lowest forms of human garbage. She slowly turned her gaze back to me, her face twisting in pure agony. For years she had looked at me and seen a naive, tired old African-American man she could easily step over and discard. Now kneeling on the floor in handcuffs, she finally saw the towering, ruthless corporate titan who had meticulously, systematically, and flawlessly dismantled her entire existence. Her supreme towering pride was not just broken, it was ground into absolute dust and scattered to the wind. The beautiful silk dress she had proudly flaunted earlier now looked like a crumpled, dirty rag against the cold, hard stone. She realized that every single bridge had been burned to ashes. There was no secret bank account waiting for her in Paris. There was no lavish future funded by my logistics empire. The realization that she was going to spend the best years of her life locked inside a federal penitentiary, stripped of all her glamorous luxuries, completely crushed her spirit. She bowed her head, her perfectly styled hair falling over her tear-streaked face, and began to weep. It was not a performance to manipulate the authorities. It was the ugly, guttural sobbing of a predator who had finally been caught trapped and completely destroyed by a far superior force. While Megan wept on the marble floor, the horrifying truth finally penetrated the thick fog of Cameron panic. He had stood frozen against the wall, processing the staggering revelation that there was no baby. The child he had boasted about to his corporate colleagues, the family he thought he was building, and the legacy he believed he was securing were all a massive manipulative illusion. He had forged his own father's signature, stolen a helpless old woman identity, locked his mother-in-law in a sweltering attic, and guaranteed himself decades in a federal penitentiary, all for an absolute lie. The pathetic whimpering suddenly stopped. A dark, terrifying shadow passed over my son's face. His breathing turned into heavy, ragged gasps. The crushing realization that his wife had played him for an absolute fool snapped the last remaining thread of his sanity. Cameron let out a deafening, unhinged roar of pure feral rage. It was not the cry of a scared man, it was the sound of an animal pushed beyond the brink of madness. He launched himself off the wall, propelling his body directly toward Megan with terrifying speed. Despite his hands being tightly cuffed behind his back, he used his full body weight to tackle her violently to the hardwood floor. Megan shrieked in absolute terror as Cameron crashed into her, pinning her down and frantically trying to bite and headbutt her in his blind fury. The grand foyer instantly erupted into absolute chaos. The police captain shouted aggressive commands as 4 heavily armed officers swarmed the thrashing couple. They grabbed Cameron by the shoulders and belt violently, ripping him off his screaming wife. Cameron fought them with unnatural adrenaline, kicking and thrashing, screaming that he was going to kill her for ruining his miserable life. The officers used overwhelming physical force, slamming him face first into the marble floor and driving a heavy knee into his back to subdue his manic struggling. They hauled him to his feet, shoving him roughly toward the open front door. Another pair of officers dragged a sobbing, hyperventilating Megan by her arms, marching her right behind him. I stood completely still in the center of the silent dining room, watching the flashing red and blue lights illuminate the driveway where my neighbors had gathered on their lawns to watch the spectacle. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them, leaving me alone in the absolute quiet of my reclaimed home. 3 days after the flashing red and blue lights faded from my driveway, I found myself sitting in the sterile, unforgiving environment of a federal courthouse. The heavy oak doors and polished marble floors felt like a fitting arena for the legal slaughter that was about to take place. I sat in the front row of the gallery wearing a charcoal gray tailored suit, my posture perfectly straight. Beside me sat Jonathan Pierce, my ruthless corporate counsel, holding a sleek black leather briefcase resting on his knees. We were there for the initial arraignment and bail hearing. When the heavy side door of the courtroom opened, the absolute reality of her new life was on full display. Megan was escorted into the room by 2 armed federal marshals. The glamorous, arrogant socialite who had sneered at me across a mahogany dining table was completely gone. She was wearing an oversized bright orange prison jumpsuit that swallowed her small frame. Her meticulously styled hair was tied back in a messy knot, and her face was entirely devoid of the expensive makeup she used to mask her true nature. The heavy steel chains around her waist and wrists clanked loudly, echoing through the cavernous room as she shuffled toward the defense table. Her attorney, a slick, fast-talking public defender because all her stolen funds were completely frozen, immediately launched into a desperate, calculated performance. He stood before the federal judge and attempted to paint Megan not as a criminal mastermind, but as a fragile, deeply traumatized victim of severe mental instability. He gestured toward her shaking frame and argued that the fake pregnancy was not a calculated financial fraud, but a tragic psychotic delusion brought on by extreme marital stress. He spun a ridiculous narrative claiming Cameron was the true mastermind who had manipulated her fragile psychological state, forcing her to participate in the identity theft and the horrific confinement of her own mother. Her defense attorney pleaded with the judge, requesting a very low bail and supervised release to a psychiatric facility, arguing she posed absolutely no flight risk and desperately needed clinical therapy rather than a federal holding cell. Megan buried her face in her shackled hands, attempting to squeeze out a few pathetic tears for the bench. The federal judge peered over his reading glasses, looking mildly sympathetic to the defense attorney's fabricated tale of female fragility. Before the judge could even entertain the notion of setting a bail amount, the lead federal prosecutor stood up from his desk. He was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who had spent the entire weekend reviewing the mountain of airtight evidence Jonathan Pierce and I had hand-delivered to the authorities. The prosecutor approached the bench carrying the exact same stark red folder I had thrown at Cameron's feet. He informed the judge that the defendant was not suffering from any form of mental delusion and was in fact the sole architect of a highly sophisticated multi-state financial conspiracy. To prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt, the prosecutor submitted the damning surveillance photographs taken by my private intelligence team. He laid out the high-definition images of Megan sneaking into the downtown hotel lobby meeting with a known black market operative to secure fraudulent legal documents. But the absolute final nail in her coffin was the physical paperwork she had commissioned. The prosecutor handed the judge the heavily drafted petition for a conservatorship. He read the vile, calculated contents out loud for the entire courtroom to hear. He detailed how Megan had methodically planned to falsely declare her wealthy, elderly father-in-law mentally incompetent. He explained her strategy to legally strip me of my civil rights forcibly, lock me inside a substandard psychiatric ward, and assume absolute total control over a multi-million-dollar corporate logistics empire. The prosecutor pointed directly at Megan and explicitly stated that her actions required extreme prolonged premeditation, absolute cognitive clarity, and an utter lack of human empathy. He then detailed the offshore banking structure of the Megan Heritage Trust, proving she was actively preparing to liquidate my stolen assets and flee the country, entirely bypassing her husband. The prosecutor concluded his devastating presentation by reminding the judge of the horrific animal sedatives she used to silence her own mother in a sweltering attic just to maintain her financial cover. The courtroom fell into a stunned, horrifying silence. The narrative of the sad, confused housewife was instantly incinerated. The judge looked down at the documents, his expression transforming from mild sympathy to absolute burning disgust. Megan's defense attorney slowly lowered himself back into his chair, completely defeated, realizing his client had lied to him about the sheer magnitude of her crimes. She was not a victim seeking therapy. She was a highly organized apex predator who had systematically tortured her family for unimaginable wealth. I glanced over at Jonathan Pierce, who was sitting beside me with a cold, predatory smile resting on his face. We had successfully armed the federal government with a nuclear arsenal of corporate espionage tactics. The sheer volume of undeniable forensic evidence we provided left the defense team with absolutely zero room to maneuver. Megan sat frozen at the defense table, her eyes wide with terror as she watched the federal prosecutor systematically dismantle her last remaining lie. She realized that every single malicious thought she had whispered in the dark had been meticulously recorded and weaponized against her. The federal judge stacked the heavily documented evidence neatly on his elevated desk. His face was set in stone as he looked down at Megan with profound, unmistakable contempt. He leaned toward his microphone and his voice echoed with absolute authority through the silent courtroom. He stated that in his 20 years on the bench, he had rarely seen a case of elder abuse and financial fraud executed with such chilling, calculated cruelty. He declared that her actions demonstrated a severe, immediate threat to the safety of the public and highlighted her extensive preparations to move stolen funds into untraceable offshore accounts. The judge raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a loud, sharp crack. He completely denied the request for bail ordering Megan to be remanded to federal custody without bond pending her criminal trial. Megan let out a piercing guttural shriek as the finality of the ruling crashed down on her. The two armed marshals immediately grabbed her arms, hauling her up from her chair and dragging her kicking and screaming toward the holding cell doors. I watched her disappear into the dark hallway, her desperate cries echoing briefly before the heavy steel doors slammed shut, sealing her fate entirely. I stood up from the gallery benches, buttoning my tailored suit jacket, preparing to leave the courthouse. Just as I turned toward the exit, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a secure text message from Bradley Thorne, my private investigator. The message was incredibly brief, but it carried the weight of total absolute victory. Bradley informed me that a heavily armed FBI tactical team had just kicked in the doors of a shady downtown law office. They were currently dragging Gregory Hayes, the disgraced black market lawyer, out of his building in handcuffs, seizing all of his computers and fraudulent files. Megan's secret lover, and the primary architect of her fake legal documents, was now securely in federal custody. The entire corrupt network they had built to destroy my life was currently burning to the ground. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked out of the courthouse into the bright morning sun, ready to visit my son in his miserable concrete cage. I drove away from the federal courthouse and headed straight toward the county detention center. The bright morning sun that had warmed my face just an hour ago was quickly replaced by the towering concrete shadows of the maximum security facility. The building was an imposing, brutalist structure designed specifically to strip away every ounce of human dignity and hope. I parked my car and walked through the heavy steel security doors, submitting myself to the rigorous screening process without a single complaint. I handed over my tailored suit jacket, emptied my pockets, and walked through the metal detectors with the cold, steady focus of a man attending a highly anticipated business liquidation. A stone-faced guard escorted me down a long, bleak corridor that smelled sharply of industrial bleach and stale sweat. He directed me to a small claustrophobic visiting booth. I sat down on the hard-bolted metal stool and stared straight ahead through the thick, smeared plexiglass window. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, annoying hum, casting a sickly, pale glow over the empty booth across from me. I waited in the oppressive silence, letting the gravity of the environment settle into my bones. 5 minutes later, a heavy steel door clanked open on the other side of the glass. 2 large correctional officers escorted my son into the room. Cameron was absolutely unrecognizable. The arrogant mid-level corporate manager who wore $2,000 tailored suits and drove European sports cars was completely gone. He was swimming in a faded, scratchy orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely over his rapidly thinning frame. His posture was entirely defeated, his shoulders slumped forward as if an invisible crushing weight was pressing down on his spine. His face was gaunt, drawn, and covered in a patchy, unkempt beard. The dark circles under his eyes were deep bruised purple, a clear indication that he had not slept a single minute since the police dragged him out of his luxurious dining room. The officers directed him to sit on the metal stool opposite me. He moved sluggishly, his hands trembling violently as he reached out to pick up the heavy black plastic telephone receiver mounted on the wall. I picked up my own receiver and held it to my ear. We sat there separated by an impenetrable barrier of bulletproof glass, staring at each other in a heavy, suffocating silence. Cameron pressed the phone tightly against his ear and immediately broke down. His voice was a pathetic, raspy whine echoing through the cheap plastic receiver. He began sobbing uncontrollably, pressing his free hand against the glass as if he could somehow reach through and grab my shirt. He begged me to forgive him. He pleaded with me to call Jonathan Pierce and drop all the federal charges. He swore up and down that he was manipulated, that Megan had brainwashed him, and that he never actually wanted to hurt Evelyn or forge my signature. He cried that he was just desperate, trying to save his marriage and his failing business. He promised me with frantic, desperate energy that if I just got him out of this concrete cage, he would completely start over. He swore he would work minimum wage, pay me back every single penny, and be the devoted, respectful son I always wanted. I sat perfectly still, my face a rigid mask of absolute indifference. I let him ramble and cry, pouring out his miserable excuses for 5 uninterrupted minutes. I did not offer a single word of comfort. When he finally ran out of breath and looked at me with wide, terrified eyes waiting for a lifeline, I spoke. My voice was low, quiet, and utterly devoid of any paternal warmth. I told him he was deeply mistaken about how the federal justice system operated. I explained that I could not drop the charges even if I wanted to because the United States government was now the prosecuting entity. He had committed severe federal wire fraud and crossed state lines with stolen identity documents. But I made it explicitly clear that even if I possessed the power to open his cell door, I would throw the key directly into the deepest part of the ocean. Cameron choked on a sob, his eyes widening in pure horror. He asked me how I could be so cruel to my own flesh and blood. I leaned forward, resting my free hand on the small metal ledge beneath the glass. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes and delivered the absolute unvarnished truth. I told him I spent my entire life fighting tooth and nail against a world designed to crush me. I built a massive corporate empire through relentless sacrifice so that my son would never have to experience the bitter sting of poverty or systemic rejection. I paid for his premium education, I bought him his first car, and I secretly purchased $1 million mansion to ensure he had a flawless foundation. I told him I gave him a set of golden wings perfectly designed so he could soar higher than I ever did. But instead of flying, he chose to crawl in the dirt. I told him he chose to be a parasitic leech. He attached himself to a sociopathic woman, completely adopted her vile arrogance, and actively sucked the life out of innocent, helpless people just to fund a pathetic illusion of wealth. I reminded him that he knew exactly what was happening in that sweltering attic. He knew Evelyn was being sedated like a wild animal, and he happily turned a blind eye because he wanted the cash. I told him his tears right now were not born out of genuine remorse or a sudden moral awakening. He was only crying because he had finally been caught and the consequences of his own horrific actions were staring him dead in the face. The crushing reality of my words hit Cameron with the force of a physical blow. The pathetic, fragile hope that had sustained him since his arrest instantly vanished from his eyes. He realized in that agonizing second that I was not there to offer him a miraculous rescue. I was there to deliver his final, absolute sentence. He pressed both hands against the thick plexiglass, smearing the surface with his sweat and tears. He screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with pure, feral desperation, telling me I was his father, and I had a fundamental duty to protect him. I looked at him one last time, feeling an overwhelming sense of closure. The painful, lingering attachment I had to the boy I once raised was entirely severed. The man sitting across from me was a convicted felon, a fraud, and a willing accomplice to torture. I told him my duty to protect him ended the exact moment he decided my life and legacy were nothing more than obstacles to his greed. I told him to get comfortable in his orange jumpsuit because he was going to be wearing it for a very long time. I did not wait for his response. I calmly pulled the heavy black plastic receiver away from my ear, severing the audio connection completely. I placed it back onto the metal wall hook with a firm, definitive click. Cameron's mouth was still moving frantically behind the glass, his face contorted in a scream I could no longer hear. He slammed his fists against the bulletproof barrier, begging me to pick the phone back up. I stood up from the bolted metal stool, straightened my tailored shirt, and turned my back on him. I walked away down the long, bleak concrete corridor with measured, steady steps. I did not stop. I did not hesitate. I did not look over my shoulder a single time. I left my biological son screaming in the soundproof void of the visiting room, perfectly abandoning him to the cold, merciless justice he had so rightfully earned. Stepping out into the bright sunlight from the county detention center, I did not waste a single moment mourning the son I had just discarded. My grief had completely evaporated inside that bleak visiting booth, replaced entirely by a clinical, relentless drive to clean up the catastrophic mess they had made of my financial ecosystem. I pulled out my phone and dialed a premier luxury real estate broker I knew from my corporate logistics days. I ordered him to list the sprawling $1.5 million suburban mansion immediately. I priced the property aggressively for a rapid all-cash sale, wanting the entire structure completely scrubbed from my real estate portfolio. I wanted the walls that hid Evelyn torment sold off to strangers, and the funds diverted back into my primary holding accounts. Next, I made a call to a highly efficient private repossession firm. I handed over the title and registration details for Cameron's expensive European sports car. He loved that vehicle, treating it like a gleaming metal trophy of his manufactured success. By noon the next day, a massive flatbed tow truck hauled it out of the mansion driveway, officially terminating his pathetic lease and liquidating the asset. But my absolute favorite piece of financial retribution involved Megan's pristine, meticulously curated closet. I hired an exclusive high-end auction house to systematically inventory every single item of designer clothing, imported footwear, and luxury handbags she had accumulated over the past 3 years. The professional appraisers spent hours bagging up her precious limited edition leather purses, her diamond-encrusted watches, and her custom-tailored silk dresses. Every single extravagant piece had been purchased using money funneled from my stolen equity or ruthlessly siphoned from her mother's stolen identity. Watching total strangers coldly tag and box up the superficial armor she used to mock the working class gave me a profound sense of justice. The auction house liquidated her entire wardrobe in less than a week, bringing in a massive sum of clean cash. I did not keep a single penny of that auction revenue for myself. I established an ironclad, irrevocable restitution trust, directing every last dollar generated from Megan prized possessions straight into a dedicated medical fund for Evelyn. The very items Megan bought with her mother suffering were now actively paying for her mother round-the-clock private nursing care and intensive physical rehabilitation. With the physical assets completely stripped and liquidated, I turned my undivided attention to the digital battlefield. I sat in Jonathan Pierce's downtown office, flanking his massive mahogany desk as we executed the final financial kill shots. Jonathan utilized the federal subpoenas we had aggressively secured to systematically dismantle the fraudulent wealth management trust. We did not just drain the accounts, we aggressively and legally erased them from existence. Every single offshore routing number, every dummy corporation registered in Delaware, and every hidden safety deposit box was permanently frozen, seized by the federal government, and repossessed under my corporate umbrella. We slammed shut every conceivable escape route, permanently starving the conspirators of any remaining capital. This relentless financial blockade had an immediate and devastating impact on Gregory Hayes, the disgraced black market lawyer who thought he could outsmart me. While Megan sat rotting in a federal holding cell, Gregory desperately attempted to access a secondary hidden international account to fund his own criminal defense. He truly believed he had carefully insulated himself from the blast radius of her arrest. He was catastrophically wrong. When Gregory logged into his encrypted banking portal from a jail computer terminal, hoping to wire a massive retainer to a high-powered defense attorney, he found an absolute zero balance and a glaring red federal seizure notice. Jonathan and I had already tracked the digital fingerprints of his illicit transfers. We provided the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI with the exact ledger showing Gregory actively accepting stolen funds from my compromised home equity line of credit. The federal agents immediately confiscated his law firm assets, froze his personal retirement accounts, and seized his luxury vehicles under civil asset forfeiture laws. Gregory was completely financially castrated. The sleazy, manipulative mastermind who explicitly drafted the fake conservatorship papers designed to lock me in a psychiatric ward was now forced to rely on a grossly overworked, underpaid public defender. He was completely trapped in the exact same unforgiving federal justice system as the woman he conspired with, sharing the exact same terrifying reality of impending decades behind bars. Watching Jonathan press the final keystroke that permanently locked Gregory out of his stolen wealth felt like watching a heavy steel vault door slam shut on their collective futures. They tried to play a high-stakes game of financial chess against a man who owned the entire board. Now they were completely bankrupted, disgraced, and awaiting lengthy federal prison sentences without a single dollar to their names. 2 weeks later, the chaotic whirlwind of legal filings, federal depositions, and financial seizures finally came to an absolute halt. I sat in the quiet stillness of Jonathan's private conference room, reviewing the finalized mountain of court-certified documents. The federal judge presiding over the wire fraud and identity theft case officially nullified the $200,000 mortgage, completely erasing the fraudulent lien against my property. The court formally dissolved the fake power of attorney Megan had forced Evelyn to sign, transferring total legal and medical proxy to the private nursing agency I had heavily vetted. I picked up my favorite heavy fountain pen and signed the final page of the asset recovery decree with a steady hand. I had successfully reclaimed absolute total control over every single penny of my hidden logistics empire. The Mitchell Logistics holding companies, the blind trusts, and my personal retirement accounts were perfectly insulated and entirely secure. I shook Jonathan's hand, thanked him for his flawless execution of my ruthless strategy, and walked out of the towering glass building into the crisp, bright afternoon air. I drove my 10-year-old sedan back to my modest suburban neighborhood, pulling into the driveway of the simple home I had fiercely protected. I walked through the front door, taking a deep, cleansing breath. The house was completely silent, devoid of ringing cell phones, desperate lies, and the suffocating presence of greedy parasites. I brewed a fresh pot of strong black coffee, poured myself a mug, and sat down in my worn, comfortable armchair facing the large bay window. I watched the golden sunlight filter through the green leaves of the majestic oak tree in my front yard. For the first time in years, my chest felt incredibly light. The brutal, violent storm of betrayal had finally passed, leaving the air completely clear and vibrant. I had surgically excised the toxic tumors from my life, and I had absolutely zero regrets. The war was officially over, and I was the only one left standing. I finished my coffee, stood up from my worn armchair, and decided it was time to check on the one truly innocent casualty of this entire horrific ordeal. I walked out to my 10-year-old sedan and drove across town to the actual luxury care facility I had originally selected for Evelyn. It was a sprawling, sunlit estate surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens, towering oak trees, and vibrant, colorful flower beds. This was the exact caliber of dignified premium care I had paid for all along, only this time my money was actually reaching its intended destination. I walked through the grand glass double doors, greeted the highly professional nursing staff, and was immediately directed to the private outdoor patio. I found Evelyn sitting comfortably in a plush wicker chair, bathing in the warm, golden afternoon sunlight. The physical transformation she had undergone was absolutely miraculous. The fragile, terrified skeleton I had carried out of that sweltering, urine-soaked attic was completely gone. Her cheeks had regained a healthy pink color. Her eyes were bright and sharply focused, and her silver hair was cleanly washed and neatly styled. She was wearing a soft, elegant knit cardigan and reading a thick novel, looking entirely peaceful and content. When she looked up from her book and saw me approaching, her face instantly lit up with a genuine, radiant smile. She immediately set her book down on the small glass table and reached out toward me with both hands. I walked over and gently took her hands in mine. They no longer felt like dry, brittle twigs snapping under the slightest pressure. They were warm, steady, and full of returning life. Evelyn looked up at me, and thick, heavy tears began to well in her eyes, spilling over her cheeks. She squeezed my hands tightly and wept loudly, not out of fear or confusion, but out of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. She thanked me repeatedly, her voice shaking with emotion, telling me that I was her guardian angel and the only person in the world who had cared enough to pull her out of the darkness. She apologized once again for the absolute monster her daughter had become and for the chaos she brought into my life. I stopped her gently, looking her directly in the eyes. I told her that she was never a burden and that she never had to look over her shoulder ever again. I assured her that she was entirely safe, highly respected, and surrounded by a dedicated staff who would fiercely protect her dignity for the rest of her life. Leaving the facility that beautiful afternoon, I felt a deep, undeniable sense of responsibility to ensure her permanent financial and medical security. I immediately drove my car back to the bustling financial district and walked straight into Jonathan Pierce's downtown office. I instructed my ruthless corporate lawyer to draft the extensive paperwork for an irrevocable, fully funded medical trust dedicated exclusively to Evelyn lifelong care. I liquidated a massive portion of the luxury assets we had legally seized from Megan fraudulent accounts and combined it with a generous continuous allocation from my own corporate logistics dividends. I locked this massive capital behind an impenetrable fortress of federal legal protections. The trust explicitly mandated that her premium nursing home fees, specialized physical therapy sessions, and any conceivable future medical expenses would be automatically and infinitely covered without question. I appointed a neutral, heavily audited third-party fiduciary firm to manage the disbursements, guaranteeing that absolutely no opportunistic relative or corrupt legal entity could ever touch a single cent of her money. Jonathan processed the dense paperwork efficiently, noting the sheer massive scale of my personal financial commitment. He looked up from his mahogany desk and asked me why I was going to such extraordinary expensive lengths for a white woman who was technically no longer related to me by law, the mother of the very sociopath who had tried to violently destroy my entire life. I signed the final heavy trust document with my fountain pen and looked at him with absolute crystal clarity. I told him I grew up in an era and a hostile society that constantly tried to strip away my basic humanity. When I was building my trucking empire in the 1980s, I faced ruthless systemic prejudice and vicious racism. I knew exactly what it felt like to be entirely powerless, dismissed as inherently worthless, and treated like a disposable second-class citizen by arrogant people who hoarded all the wealth and authority. I survived that bitter, degrading crucible by developing a hardened, unbreakable exterior. I fought tooth and nail against bitter men who wanted to see me fail simply because of the color of my skin. But I never once let the cruelty of the world rot my soul or turn my heart to stone. I refused to let the severe bitterness I experienced turn me into a cold-blooded monster like Megan or Cameron. True supreme power does not come from crushing the weak or hoarding stolen wealth in secret offshore bank accounts. True power comes from the absolute ability to extend unyielding protection to those who cannot defend themselves. Securing Evelyn's dignity was not a simple act of charity. It was a definitive, undeniable statement of my character. It was my way of proving that a black man who crawled through the dirt to build an empire would use his supreme, hard-earned power to restore light rather than perpetuate the darkness. With Evelyn's future permanently secured and my vast financial empire completely insulated from any further attacks, the dust of the chaotic legal battle finally settled. The heavy, relentless machinery of the federal justice system was now grinding steadily toward its inevitable crushing conclusion. A few short weeks later, I walked to my mailbox and received a formal certified letter from the lead federal prosecutor handling the massive wire fraud and severe elder abuse case. I opened the crisp envelope standing in my quiet kitchen and read the official notice. The definitive sentencing date for both Cameron and Megan had been officially set on the federal court docket. They had spent the last several grueling months locked inside maximum security federal holding facilities entirely stripped of their expensive designer clothes, their imported vintage champagne, and their bloated sociopathic egos. Without access to any stolen funds or high-powered black market defense attorneys, their government-appointed legal counsel had been completely overwhelmed by the sheer undeniable magnitude of our forensic and digital evidence. There were absolutely no plea deals offered, no leniency granted, and no procedural loopholes left to exploit. Gregory Hayes, the disgraced lawyer who helped them, was also facing his own brutal sentencing, entirely bankrupted and ruined. The prosecutor informed me in the letter that the federal judge presiding over the case was highly notorious for handing down the absolute maximum statutory penalties for crimes involving the malicious exploitation of vulnerable seniors and severe federal identity theft. I folded the heavy paper, placed it neatly on my granite kitchen counter, and looked out the large bay window at the quiet, peaceful street. The autumn leaves were beginning to change color, signaling the end of a long, turbulent season. There was absolutely no anxiety left in my chest, no lingering sadness over the son I had lost, and absolutely no regret for the actions I had taken. I had masterfully orchestrated a flawless surgical strike against two vicious predators who fatally mistook my silence for weakness. I had completely dismantled their horrific criminal conspiracy, reclaimed my stolen legacy, and rescued an innocent life from the absolute brink of death. Everything was perfectly aligned. The chaotic board was entirely cleared, the legal pieces were firmly set in stone, and the final checkmate was just a few days away. I went to bed that night, resting my head on my pillow, knowing with absolute certainty that the impending sunrise would finally bring the absolute final judgment they so richly deserved. The day of the federal sentencing arrived with a heavy, overcast sky, a fitting backdrop for the absolute finality of the courtroom. I sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Jonathan Pierce, wearing the exact same charcoal suit I wore when I first built my logistics empire. When the heavy wooden doors opened, the marshals led Cameron and Megan into the room. They were chained at the wrists and ankles, shuffling forward in matching bright orange jumpsuits. The stark fluorescent lights illuminated the catastrophic toll the past few months in federal holding had taken on them. Megan was completely unrecognizable. The haughty designer-clad socialite was gone, replaced by a hollow, trembling shell of a woman whose sheer arrogance had finally been crushed under the weight of her own sociopathy. Cameron looked physically ill, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the gallery. The federal judge did not waste time with lengthy preambles. He looked down from the bench with a gaze of unyielding disgust. He addressed Megan first, outlining her role as the primary architect of the identity theft, the wire fraud, and the horrific, systematic abuse of her own mother. The judge stated that her complete lack of human empathy and her manipulative deceit warranted the absolute maximum penalty under federal guidelines. He struck his heavy wooden gavel and sentenced Megan to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Megan did not scream this time. Her legs simply gave out, and the marshals had to physically hold her up as she openly wept, her spirit entirely broken. Next, the judge turned his hardened gaze to my son. He admonished Cameron for his staggering cowardice, for mortgaging his own father home, and for turning a blind eye to the torture of an elderly woman just to fund a pathetic illusion of wealth. The judge sentenced Cameron to 8 years in federal prison. My son turned his head slowly, looking back at me from the defense table. His eyes were wide, silently begging for a final ounce of paternal sympathy. I sat perfectly still, my expression a rigid mask of cold stone. I did not nod. I did not blink. I offered him absolutely nothing. He lowered his head and allowed the armed guards to lead him away, finally accepting that his father was gone forever. 6 months have passed since those heavy courtroom doors swung shut, permanently sealing away the darkest chapter of my life. The brutal, chaotic storm of betrayal, financial espionage, and courtroom battles has completely faded into a distant memory. I am currently sitting on the wooden front porch of my modest suburban home, the exact same house I fiercely protected from their greedy, grasping hands. The early morning air is crisp and cool, carrying the fresh scent of dew and damp earth. I am holding a mug of strong black coffee, watching the golden sunlight slowly filter through the thick green canopy of the majestic oak tree in my front yard. The neighborhood is incredibly quiet, peaceful, and entirely devoid of the toxic, suffocating presence that once threatened to consume everything I held dear. Some people in the community who caught wind of the federal trial look at me with profound pity. They see an aging African-American widower whose only son violently betrayed him, a senior citizen who almost lost his home and his life savings to a vicious scam. They think I am a tragic victim of elder abuse who barely managed to survive a horrific family nightmare. But as I take a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee, I know the absolute truth. I am not a victim. I have never been a victim. When you build a massive corporate empire from the ground up in the unforgiving landscape of the 1980s, you learn how to identify a lethal threat before it destroys your foundation. You learn that survival requires making brutal, uncompromising decisions. I did not just survive an attack from my own flesh and blood. I acted as a cold, calculating surgeon. I identified a malignant, poisonous tumor growing rapidly inside my family, and I used every single resource at my disposal to completely excise it from my life. I systematically dismantled their fraudulent schemes, crushed their arrogant illusions, and threw them into the unforgiving gears of the federal justice system. I amputated the rotting branches of my family tree so that the core of my legacy could remain pristine and healthy. I look out at my carefully tended garden, the vibrant flowers blooming in the morning sun, and I feel a profound, unshakable sense of tranquility. I have reclaimed my absolute freedom. My vast logistics fortune is entirely secure, protected by ironclad blind trusts that no greedy relative will ever touch. Evelyn is living out her remaining years wrapped in dignity and premium medical care, fully funded by the very assets Megan tried to steal. I saved an innocent life, and I protected my own. I do not feel lonely in this quiet house. I feel incredibly light, unburdened by the heavy, toxic expectations of unconditional love for people who viewed me as nothing more than a walking bank account. I fought the hardest battle of my entire life, not in a corporate boardroom, but right here in my own dining room, and I emerged entirely victorious. My mind is sharp, my conscience is crystal clear, and my future belongs exclusively to me. I spend my afternoons reading history, managing my philanthropic investments, and walking through the local parks with my head held high. I proved that a man's worth is not determined by the ungrateful children he leaves behind, but by the unyielding integrity he maintains when the world attempts to strip him of his power. The quiet rustle of the oak leaves in the wind sounds like a standing ovation, a gentle reminder that I did exactly what needed to be done. The most valuable lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is a harsh truth that many people spend their entire lives trying to ignore. Blood does not automatically make someone family. Genetics do not grant anyone a free pass to exploit abuse or disrespect you. True family is built entirely on a solid foundation of mutual loyalty, unwavering respect, and genuine character. When someone looks you in the eyes and shows you that they value your wallet far more than your physical and emotional well-being, you must believe them the very first time. You must have the fierce courage to walk away from toxic people, even if they share your last name, before they drag you down into their own miserable abyss. Wealth and success are undeniably powerful tools, but they are completely meaningless if you allow them to be drained by greedy, manipulative parasites. I worked too hard, fought through too much systemic prejudice, and sacrificed too much of my youth to let two arrogant, entitled thieves tear down my life work. Protecting your peace of mind is the absolute ultimate form of self-respect. Never allow anyone to mistake your quiet humility for weakness, because the moment you do, you surrender your hard-earned power. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how you would have handled this ultimate betrayal. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There is so much more on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect. Another profound lesson I carry with me is that society dangerously equates silence and old age with weakness. People often assume that because your hair has turned gray and your life has quieted down, your mind has dulled and your spirit has surrendered. They easily mistake a gentle demeanor for gullibility. But true strength does not need to announce itself with loud threats or flashy displays of power. Sometimes the most formidable adversaries are the ones sitting quietly in the corner, observing everything and meticulously calculating their next move. Never let anyone project their underestimation onto you, and never apologize for fiercely protecting your own peace. Have you ever had to teach someone the hard way that your kindness is not a weakness? Let me know your story down in the comments.